Good evening, night wanderers. You've found your way back to this corner of the dark, where the hours move slower and the walls seem to lean closer. Here, stories breathe. Here, voices that should be silent still know how to whisper. Tonight, I'll be your companion through 7 tales stitched together like shadows on a long, deserted road. Each one is a door that should perhaps remain closed, yet once opened, it will not shut so easily. We'll move through houses that remember too much, roads that don't forgive the living, and faces that press against glass long after the body is gone. So find your place, pull the blanket higher, let the world outside dissolve into night. The stories are waiting, and they've been waiting for you. The third party. The night had no edges in Lily's apartment, only a slow and endless dimness that seeped in through the curtains and settled on the furniture like dust. She lay curled against the cold glow of her phone, scrolling through images she both craved and dreaded. Faces she once knew now turned away, laughter caught in frozen frames that seemed louder than any sound in the room. The man she had loved, the one who had promised constellations and quiet mornings, appeared again and again beside someone else, a woman whose beauty felt sharp as broken glass, a beauty that seemed designed to cut Lily down with every photograph. The longer she stared, the less she felt like herself, as if the phone were draining not only her attention but her shape, her weight, her place in the world. Her body ached with a stillness she could not shake, her breath uneven, shallow, caught between wanting to cry and being too tired to try. The apartment offered no comfort. The walls were mute, the air heavy, and even her reflection in the darkened window looked distant, detached, a stranger pretending to wear her face. She wanted the ache to stop, the circling thoughts, the silence that stretched into every corner. On the top shelf of her closet, half forgotten, was the coil of rope she once bought for hanging plants she never cared for, a rope that seemed to hum faintly in her memory as if it had been waiting all along. She rose slowly, as though moving underwater, and dragged a chair across the floor. It scraped low and tired, not defiant but resigned. Setting it beneath the ceiling beam, she touched the rope with unsteady fingers, feeling its roughness crumble faintly onto her skin. The chair swayed slightly as she stepped back, her breath catching, her heart pacing unevenly, her thoughts whispering that perhaps this was the closest she would come to peace. The window reflected her hesitation, her face blurred by shadows, and for a moment she thought she saw another outline leaning close behind her, though the room was empty. The chair waited, the rope waited, and Lily, trembling in the dimness, wondered if tonight would be the night she finally disappeared. The rope swayed faintly in her hands, not because of any breeze, but because her fingers refused to be steady, and in that trembling she heard something softer than breath, a sound that seemed to come from just behind her ear, low and coaxing, the kind of murmur that does not command but invites, a voice neither hers nor fully separate, a presence that slid into her thoughts as easily as water finds a crack in stone. "Do it," it whispered, though the word did not feel spoken in language but rather pulsed through her body like a suggestion too gentle to resist. It will all stop. The ache, the remembering, the weight that never lifts. You deserve silence. You deserve rest. Lily froze, her chest tightening as if the air itself had leaned closer, and though she told herself it was imagination, a trick born from exhaustion, her body knew it differently, because her skin prickled with the awareness of someone standing where no one should be. She lifted her head slowly toward the window, the glass dark enough to mirror her outline, and in that faint reflection she saw the suggestion of movement behind her, a shadow leaning forward, lips almost touching her ear. Her throat tightened. "This is me," she told herself. "This is my mind." But the whisper came again, smooth and unwavering, wrapping itself around her thoughts like a lullaby. "He is happy without you. He has forgotten you. Why do you remain? There is only one way to let go." The chair stood ready, the rope heavier now, as though it had taken on meaning beyond its fibers. Her knees buckled and she sank down to the floor, clutching the rope against her chest as if by holding it she could delay the decision it demanded. The apartment pressed closer, the walls damp with silence, and she realized she had not heard the hum of the refrigerator or the ticking of the clock for minutes now, as though the room itself had been hushed to better carry the voice. Her mind recoiled, searching for a sound of her own, but all she could hear was the persuasion, soft and rhythmic, reminding her of things she tried not to remember, her lover's new smile, the nights of cold sheets, the feeling of vanishing step by step. The whisper curved itself into her doubts and answered them before she could think. Yes, yes, you are alone. Yes, yes. It is easier this way. Her breathing grew shallow. Her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She wanted to scream to break the spell, but her jaw felt heavy, sealed by some unseen weight. It was then she realized she was no longer sure which thoughts were hers and which belonged to the one who leaned so close behind. The glass of the window drew her eyes as though it had been waiting, a dark pane half alive with shifting shadows, and in its depth she could no longer see only herself but a distortion, a ripple, a second figure bleeding into her outline like ink spreading through water, taller and closer than anyone should have been, a shape of a woman whose face was blurred at first, as if the glass itself resisted showing her, until slowly the emptiness resolved into hollow eyes and a mouth that did not move yet somehow spoke, the same honeyed voice that had been coiling through Lily's mind, now pressing into her ear with the weight of a presence undeniable. Her breath stuttered, sharp and uneven, and the rope fell from her hands, though she did not remember dropping it, her palms still tingling with the memory of its fibers, and she tried to turn, to confront whatever leaned so near, but the room behind her remained unchanged, only the furniture waiting in its silence. While the window told a truth she could not deny, there was someone standing in the reflection who did not exist in the room. The woman's face was both familiar and foreign, as if drawn from the deepest recess of Lily's own despair, her cheeks pale and bloodless, her hair clinging in damp strands to skin that seemed too smooth, too perfect, the beauty of a mannequin rather than a living body, and her lips hovered so close to Lily's ear that Lily could almost feel the brush of cold breath, though when she lifted a hand to touch, her fingers closed on nothing but air. The whisper deepened, wrapping her name like a promise. Lily, Lily, don't fight it. I will take the burden from you. You don't need to suffer alone. I am here now. Let me finish what you cannot. And Lily felt a surge of panic that broke through the trance, a sound clawing out of her throat before she realized she was screaming, a raw, startled cry that ripped the silence apart. She stumbled back, chair tipping, the thud echoing through the floorboards like a drumbeat, and she ran from the room without looking again, the walls narrowing around her as though the apartment itself had closed ranks, her bare feet striking cold tile, her lungs burning with every desperate breath. Yet even as she reached the safety of the living room, clutching her chest with trembling hands, the memory of the reflection clung to her, because she knew she had not imagined it. She had seen the outline, the vacant eyes, the waiting mouth, and once something has been seen in glass, it cannot easily be unseen. The rest of the night passed in fragments, light flickering from passing cars, the hum of distant traffic. Her body curled against the couch in uneasy exhaustion, but when the gray wash of morning seeped through the blinds, she found herself drawn once more to the window of her bedroom, heart hammering as though it already knew what she would find. And there, beyond the glass, in the pale light of dawn, a face lingered on the other side, not her own, watching with a stillness too patient to belong to the living. The morning did not chase the shadows away. It only thinned them into a gray veil that pressed against the glass. And Lily, hollow, eyed from a night of broken sleep, found herself standing once more before the window, though she had sworn not to, her breath clouding faintly on the surface, her pulse uneven as though her body already knew what her eyes had not yet dared to see. At first there was only her reflection, wan and exhausted, but then, as her gaze lingered, the shimmer of another outline began to form beside her, sharper than before, a face rising out of the dimness beyond the pane, so close it seemed to lean against the glass, a pale woman's visage stripped of warmth, eyes wide and unblinking, pupils too large, lips slightly parted as if about to whisper again, though the sound came not through the air but directly into Lily's head. She staggered back, yet the face did not retreat, pressing forward as though the thin boundary of glass were nothing but water ready to ripple and break, and Lily saw her own features echoed faintly within it, as though this figure had borrowed pieces of her appearance, stretching them into something lifeless, a doppelganger hollowed out and returned as a cruel imitation. The longer she looked, the more the resemblance deepened, until she was not sure if she stared at another woman, or at the version of herself that would exist if she gave in, if she tied the rope, if she let the chair topple beneath her. The voice swelled in rhythm with the pounding of her heart, no longer a whisper but a steady persuasion, every word smooth, Inevitable. I am already here. You called me when you thought of leaving. I am what waits on the other side of silence, and I will not let go until you finish what you began. The room trembled with her panic, her knees weak, her chest aching, her throat raw as she tried to cry out but only gasped instead. The sound small and useless against the pressure building inside her head. She lunged to pull the curtains closed, but the fabric seemed too thin, light seeping through in cracks, and behind every gap the face pressed nearer, mouth opening wider, eyes fixed with an intensity that burned her vision even when she turned away. She could feel it now, a weight against her skin, the suggestion of cold breath at her neck, the brush of fingers that never touched but threatened always to. And she realized there was no safety in running, because the reflection had already crossed into her, had already learned her shape and voice in despair, and nothing she did could undo what had been invited. The rope still lay where she had dropped it, coiled like a waiting answer on the floor, and when her gaze fell upon it, she saw, in the edge of the glass, the pale figure smiling faintly for the first time, a smile that did not belong to grief or comfort but to triumph. And Lily knew that this was not merely a haunting but a transaction, a bargain unspoken, and that the thing behind the window would never stop until she either obeyed or found some way to shut the glass forever. Her body quaked, her breath came in ragged bursts, and as the light of day grew harsher, she realized the face outside was no longer fading with the sun, no longer a night-born illusion, but something fixed, enduring, patient, and closer than ever, its forehead nearly pressed against the pane, as though waiting for the next faltering moment to break through and finish what she had almost begun. By the second night, she no longer trusted the silence, because silence had become the place where the voice lived, and even when she pressed her palms hard against her ears, she could still hear it moving beneath her thoughts, curling through every pause, reminding her that the rope was not gone, that the glass was not empty, that what waited outside had all the time in the world. She avoided the window, curled on the couch with the lights left burning, but the bulbs hummed faintly and dimmed without reason, and when she lifted her head, the reflection in the darkened screen of her phone showed more than her own face, a pale sliver of the other woman leaning close, patient, smiling faintly as if certain of the ending. Lily whispered to herself just to hear her own voice, but the words trembled, half swallowed, and the reply came smooth and confident from nowhere and everywhere. You don't have to fight anymore. It is easier to let me carry it, easier to become what you were always meant to be. She pressed her hands against her chest, feeling her heart thunder, but with each beat it seemed less like her own, as though something else had matched its rhythm and was beginning to guide it. On the third morning, when she gathered what little strength she had and forced herself to the bedroom door, the curtains already hung open, though she swore she had tied them shut, and the face at the window was clearer than ever, skin pale as porcelain, eyes vast and dark, lips parted in a patient smile. Lily's legs weakened and she dropped to the floor, unable to look away, because the glass no longer felt like a boundary but like a surface of water trembling before it breaks, and as she stared she saw her own reflection sliding backward into the dark behind the other woman, fading, dissolving, replaced. The rope was still there, and she understood now it had never been about ending but about exchange, a ritual as old as despair, the offering of one life for another presence to step through. She tried to cry out, but the sound caught, and in the stillness that followed, she realized the voice in her head had stopped speaking separately and had become her own. The words indistinguishable, her thoughts no longer hers alone. Neighbors would later say they noticed the curtains drawn tight for weeks, no movement behind them, only the faint suggestion of someone at the window when the streetlights flickered on. Some swore they had seen a young woman's face there, pale and watchful. Others described someone else entirely, a stranger with hollow eyes leaning close against the glass, but all agreed on one thing: there were always two faces, never one, as if the window had taken on a third presence, lingering, waiting, patient. And if you stand long enough outside in the dark, looking up at that apartment window, you might see the faintest outline of Lily staring back, her lips moving as if to speak, though whether she is begging for help or whispering you closer, there is no way to be certain, because once a reflection is claimed, it does not let go, and the glass remembers every face it keeps. The frozen road. The last stretch of road felt endless beneath the gray sky, a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt that wound through forests, already stripped bare by late autumn winds. and when the engine coughed once and died, the silence that followed seemed heavier than the cold. Alex sat at the wheel for a long moment with his hands still gripping it, as though if he held tightly enough the car might remember how to breathe. But the only sound was the soft hiss of air escaping from a failing radiator, and the muffled shuffle of Ben kicking at the glove box in frustration. Chris leaned forward from the back seat, his forehead nearly pressed to the glass, watching the fog of his own breath loom against the window, and for a moment he thought he saw something move in the trees, though it could have been nothing more than wind-stirring branches already brittle with frost. They tried the engine again and again, but the car answered only with silence. The road stretched empty in both directions. No headlights, no houses, no signs of life, just the pale horizon of a night settling in too fast. It was Alex who finally spoke, voice tight with the edge of forced calm. "We walk. There's a town 20 miles south. If we keep moving, we'll see lights by morning." Ben grumbled, already tugging his jacket tighter, while Chris hesitated, the cold pressing into his bones even before he opened the door. The air outside bit sharp and immediate, colder than any of them had expected, the kind of cold that felt alive, sliding beneath clothing and curling into lungs. Their boots crunched against the first dusting of snow that had begun to fall, flakes drifting slow and soundless at first, then thickening into a steady veil that blurred the road ahead. The car, their last shelter, disappeared behind them sooner than expected, swallowed by the dark and the snow, until they were three figures moving through a landscape that seemed to erase itself with every step. Ben tried to joke, his words puffing into white vapor, but the sound died quickly, muffled by the air as though even the atmosphere did not want noise. Alex walked with his jaw set, eyes fixed ahead, the determination of someone who believed in reaching the end of the road simply by refusing to look anywhere else. Chris lingered behind, his senses tangled with unease, every shift of wind carrying something more than cold, a presence that seemed to slip between the flakes, brushing his skin with a chill deeper than the weather. He told himself it was exhaustion, that his mind was inventing shapes in the dark, but the certainty remained. This was not just the winter pressing against them. There was another kind of cold here, older, patient, and watching. As they trudged on, the silence of the forest pressed close, broken only by their uneven breaths and the drag of boots through snow, and Chris felt more than once the prickle of eyes against his back, though each time he turned there was nothing but endless white and the skeletal outlines of trees bending beneath it. He kept moving, yet with every step the weight of the night seemed to settle heavier, as though the road itself did not want them to leave, as though something unseen was pacing quietly at their side. The snow deepened until each step felt like wading through ash, their boots sinking and dragging, the road dissolving beneath layers of white that erased every direction except forward. And when their breaths grew ragged and their limbs heavy with the ache of exhaustion, Chris was the first to notice the faint glow ahead, a flicker against the dark horizon, no brighter than a lantern but steady enough to draw the eye. He called out hoarsely, and Alex, half stumbling, lifted his head to see it too, the relief in his voice sharp as he muttered finally, while Ben broke into a clumsy run that scattered snow in arcs behind him. The glow resolved into a fire, flames licking upward from a circle of blackened stones, though the air remained bitter, untouched by warmth, and around it sat a cluster of figures wrapped in coats that looked too thin for the weather, their bodies hunched, faces tilted downward, hands hidden. The three friends staggered into the circle, the crackle of flame promising comfort. But when Chris extended his palms to the fire, he felt nothing, no heat, only the same cutting chill gnawing at his skin. He withdrew quickly, heart quickening, eyes darting from the flame to the people surrounding it. They did not speak. They did not lift their heads. They sat in a silence deeper than the snow itself, breaths invisible, movements absent, as though they had been waiting there, not for warmth, but for company. Ben collapsed onto the ground with a groan of relief, shoulders slack, eyes closing almost at once, and Alex followed, stretching his hands toward the useless fire with a muttered curse about how weak it seemed, too tired to question why it burned without heat. Chris lingered, his body rigid with unease, scanning their companions. Shadows veiled their features, but in the erratic light he caught glimpses of skin pale as the snow around them, eyes half hidden, lips pressed in stillness that felt less like rest and more like refusal. The fire snapped sharply, a burst of sparks rising into the dark, and for an instant the glow revealed the truth Chris had been dreading. The figures cast no shadows, their forms outlined by flame but untouched by it, as if they were nothing more than shapes carved from the night itself. His throat tightened, and he reached to shake Alex's shoulder, voice breaking as he urged them to get up, to keep moving. But Alex only shook his head, muttering that he was too tired, that the town could wait, and Ben had already curled into himself, breathing slow and shallow, lulled by a false comfort. Chris stood trembling, his own legs begging for rest, his body heavy with cold, but some deeper instinct pulled at him, warning that if he sat, if he stayed, he would never rise again. The figures around the fire shifted faintly as though sensing his decision, heads tilting in eerie unison, though no eyes met his, and in the hollow silence of their company he felt more alone than he had ever known. Chris rose unsteadily, every muscle pleading for him to stay, the false glow of the fire tugging at his body like a net. But he forced himself backward, his boots sinking into snow that felt deeper with every step, his breath catching as he glanced at his friends slumped against the stones, their faces slack with exhaustion, their eyes closed as though they had already surrendered to sleep. He whispered their names, once, twice, the sound dissolving into the stillness, and when neither stirred, he turned away, pushing himself into the darkness with the single thought that if he kept moving long enough, he would reach the town, he would bring help, he would not let the night claim them all. The snow came harder now, wind curling it into spirals that stung his face, the road a ghost beneath his boots, yet something heavier than weather pressed against him, a sensation that thickened the air at his back, each step forward shadowed by the certainty of another step just behind. His lungs burned, his legs ached, and still the presence grew, the silence of the forest no longer empty but filled with the faint rhythm of breath that was not his own, warm and damp against the nape of his neck, as though someone leaned close enough to follow his every movement. He tried not to look, tried to keep his eyes fixed on the dim horizon, but the pull was too strong, and when he turned his head, he saw them, three figures standing in the snow, no more than a few paces behind, their outlines wavering as though made of smoke, faces obscured, bodies blurred, but unmistakably human in their stance, watching him with a patience that froze his blood more thoroughly than the cold ever could. His chest seized with terror, his pulse a drumbeat in his ears, and he stumbled forward, nearly falling, forcing his body into a clumsy run, snow spraying beneath him, the darkness shifting at the edges of his vision. He did not dare to glance back again, but he felt them there, every footfall matched, every ragged breath mirrored, as if the night itself had multiplied behind him into forms that wanted not to catch him but simply to follow, step after step, until he no longer had the strength to move. The road stretched endlessly, his limbs screaming, his breath a knife in his lungs, and still he ran, the thought of his friends burning at the back of his mind, the fireless warmth they had chosen, the faces that had lifted as he left, and the shadows that had risen from them, now chasing him through the endless snow. The night stretched around him like an ocean of snow and wind, every direction dissolving into pale blur, and Chris ran until his legs felt hollow, until his chest seared with each breath, the sound of his own heartbeat filling his head like a drumbeat that might split him open. Behind him, the presence clung, not the pounding of pursuit, but the steadier rhythm of shadows that never lost distance, never fell behind, as though they were not bound by the same exhaustion that dragged at his bones. He wanted to scream, to break the silence, but his throat was raw, and the only voice left was the one inside, whispering that he could not stop, not even for an instant, because if he did, those figures would fold into him like smoke into lungs, and he would never reach the morning. Snow whipped across his face, stinging, blinding, and when he stumbled, nearly falling to his knees, he thought for a moment it was the end, but through the white haze a faint glow appeared, different from the strange fire they had found in the woods, this light steadier, warmer in its color, rising faintly against the horizon like a promise. He blinked through tears and frost, each step pulling it closer, the outlines sharpening into the suggestion of rooftops, lamplight spilling weak but real through the snow. The sight struck through him like a knife of hope, and with a ragged sob he forced his legs to move faster, every muscle screaming, the town beckoning just far enough ahead to seem impossible yet close enough to drag him forward. The shadows pressed closer as though sensing the threshold, the air thickening with their presence, and he could almost feel their breath mixing with his own, could almost hear their weightless steps matching his. But for the first time he refused to look back, because he knew the town was there, real and solid, and if he gave them his eyes he might lose the path. The glow grew brighter with every desperate stride, until he saw the outline of a street lamp, its halo shimmering through the snow, and the instant his boots struck the edge of pavement lit by that circle of light, the weight behind him vanished, the air clearing in a sudden release that left him stumbling forward onto his hands and knees, sobbing into the frozen ground. He lifted his head, breath coming in ragged bursts, eyes wide as he scanned the road behind. But there was nothing, only the endless white, the trees swaying under their burden, the storm thickening, no figures, no shadows, as if they had never been there at all. Yet his skin still burned with the memory of breath at his neck, and his ears still rang with silence that had not belonged to the night alone. He dragged himself upright, trembling, and staggered into the streets of the sleeping town, the lamplight flickering overhead, his mind clinging to the thought that he had escaped, though every corner of his body whispered that what had followed him was not gone but merely waiting. Morning arrived pale and reluctant, the storm having dulled into a silence that blanketed the town in drifts of white, and Chris, half delirious with exhaustion, told his story again and again until enough villagers gathered coats and lanterns and followed him back toward the forest road. His voice cracked as he spoke, words tumbling unevenly, but no one questioned his urgency, for the fear in his eyes carried a truth no one could deny. They walked through snow that reached their knees, the trees bending overhead like silent witnesses, and though daylight thinned the shadows, Chris felt them still, hovering at the edges, as though the forest knew what they would find. The place appeared sooner than he wanted, the clearing where the fire had burned, though now only blackened stones remained, dusted with frost. The last curls of smoke long vanished. Alex and Ben lay slumped on the ground, their bodies rigid, their faces pale and waxy, eyes closed as though still caught in exhausted sleep. Chris staggered forward, dropping to his knees, calling their names, shaking their shoulders, but the cold that clung to them was final, deeper than the winter air. Their lips were faintly blue, their breath absent, and their limbs frozen where they had fallen. The villagers stood in uneasy silence, lanterns casting long arcs of light across the snow, and it was one of them who first noticed the heap of fabric near the stones, coats, scarves, gloves, piled carelessly as though shed by those who had no further use for them. Chris reached with trembling hands, lifting a sleeve stiff with frost, and realized it was not new, not modern, but weathered and brittle with age, the kind of clothing that belonged to decades past. He let it fall, his stomach hollow, his mind circling back to the figures who had sat so still, so silent, and the fire that had burned without heat. No footprints remained but their own, the snow untouched around the clearing, as though nothing had ever gathered there but the three of them, as though the companions at the fire had been smoke and memory only. Yet Chris could feel eyes still on him, not from the villagers who stood uneasily behind, but from the trees, from the air itself, as if the cold had taken notice of him now, marked him, kept him as the one who left when the others stayed. He buried his face in his hands, breath-breaking, the weight of survival pressing crueler than the storm, and when he finally looked up again, he thought, just for an instant, that he saw three faint outlines lingering in the tree line too familiar, one not before the wind shifted and the snow swallowed them whole. And though the villagers carried him back, though they told him it was grief and shock, Chris knew the truth was colder. Some fires burn not to warm but to wait, and once you sit with those who have frozen, part of you never leaves the road. The level crossing. Michael had always believed that the camera could hold more than light, that film and pixels could gather whispers of things no one else noticed, the weight of a silence in a forgotten house, the breath of a field at dusk, the faint suggestion of memory caught in the way a shadow tilted across a road. It was why he traveled alone to the smallest places, the towns left behind by progress, where the tracks had rusted and the stations had been shuttered for decades, where stories clung longer than people. When he stepped off the bus that afternoon, the town felt like it was folded into its own past. The streets quiet, windows dim, the air sharp with the kind of chill that announces the season's end. He asked a shopkeeper for directions, and the man only gestured vaguely toward the edge of town, muttering that there was nothing to see but weeds and iron, though his eyes shifted away as though unwilling to meet Michael's too directly. The path out was lined with hedges gone brittle, and when Michael finally saw the rails, he felt the peculiar stillness he often sought the way abandoned places seemed to pause in time, waiting. The tracks stretched across the countryside, red-brown with rust, grass growing between them, wooden ties splintered and soft with age. A faded crossing sign leaned at an angle, the paint almost gone, the words unreadable, and nearby an old gate sagged, chained loosely but unlocked, as though it were not meant to keep anyone out but rather to keep something in. He lifted his camera and began to shoot, framing the rails as they vanished toward the horizon, the way the late sun pooled in the hollows, the melancholy of decay. He knew the story already, every town had one, whispered at the edges of conversations. A girl who had died too young, struck here by a train that no longer ran, her spirit said to wander the tracks when the air grew cold. Some said they had heard the horn of an engine where no train existed. Others swore they had seen a figure darting across the rails in twilight, a basket of flowers swinging from her arm, her face never clear until you were too close to turn away. As he adjusted his lens, a breeze lifted that seemed sharper than before, tugging at his coat, carrying with it the faint metallic echo of something distant, a note stretched and mournful, so low he almost thought it was memory rather than sound. His finger froze on the shutter. The countryside lay empty, only fields and sky, yet the vibration of that horn lingered in his chest, a resonance without source, and for the first time since arriving, Michael felt the weight of eyes upon him, as if the crossing had remembered its story and was waiting for him to believe it. Michael lingered at the edge of the tracks, adjusting his stance, the tripod legs pressed unevenly into the grass that grew in clumps through the splintered ties. The evening light had shifted into that fragile hour when everything seemed more saturated, colors deepening while the world itself quieted, as if holding its breath before surrendering to dusk. It was always his favorite time to work the liminal space between day and night, where shadows stretched long and the landscape carried a tension it could not name. His camera clicked steadily, the soft rattle of the shutter blending with the sigh of the wind, each frame capturing not only iron and wood but the stillness of a place that felt less abandoned than waiting. He moved down the tracks, boots crunching on gravel, until he found a crossing gate half hidden by weeds. It leaned at an angle as though tired of standing, its chain rusted through, the padlock broken long ago. He paused to photograph it, angling the camera so the horizon dipped just behind, a trick of perspective that made the structure seem monumental, lonely in its persistence. And yet, even as he framed the shot, the sensation returned, the weight of something watching, not hostile but intent, a gaze that pressed against his skin like the chill of early frost. He lowered the camera, scanning the fields. They spread wide and open, empty but for the brittle grasses that bent in the wind. Then he saw movement. At first it was no more than a flicker of white, a blur in the corner of his vision. He thought perhaps it was a bird startled from the hedges or a scrap of paper lifted by the wind, but the movement continued, flitting across the tracks some 30 yards ahead, a small figure darting lightly from one side to the other, the rhythm almost playful, like a child lost in a game. Michael's breath caught. He narrowed his eyes, hand tightening on the strap of his camera, and realized he was not watching an illusion. There was a girl, slender, hair the color of dusk itself, a small wicker basket swinging from one hand as she hopped across the rails, back and forth, her steps almost too quick for the eye to follow. He blinked hard, expecting the figure to vanish with the trick of light, but she remained, skipping nimbly, her dress pale and thin enough that the wind seemed to thread through it, though she moved as if the cold had no claim on her. The basket bumped lightly against her hip with each motion, and Michael caught the suggestion of color within shapes like petals, soft and bruised, flowers that should not have survived the frost of late autumn. His fingers trembled on the camera as he lifted it, instinct stronger than hesitation, and the lens caught her mid-motion, the faint curve of her smile as she turned in profile, the strange blur at her edges, as though she were both solid and not. The shutter snapped. She stopped. The change was immediate, unnerving. One moment she was in motion, skipping lightly as if caught in her own melody, and the next she stood utterly still in the center of the tracks, basket at her side, head tilted slightly downward. Michael adjusted the lens, breath locked in his chest, certain she would vanish now that he looked too closely. But instead she lifted her chin slowly, deliberately, until her gaze aligned with the camera. Her eyes were not what he expected. They were not the bright eyes of a child caught in mischief, nor the distant eyes of someone unaware. They were hollow, black wells that drank the light, voids without reflection, so absolute that even the gleam of the setting sun refused to touch them. He froze, finger trembling against the shutter, every instinct screaming to lower the camera, to look away, but his body betrayed him, compelled to capture the impossible. The shutter clattered again, loud in the stillness, and through the viewfinder he watched as those eyes locked on his, unblinking, the corners of her lips twitching with something too small to be a smile. The air thickened around him, his breath condensed in heavy clouds, though the temperature had not changed, and the silence of the fields became immense, swallowing the rustle of grass, the sigh of wind, even the faint echo of distant traffic. It was as if the world itself leaned in closer to watch. Michael lowered the camera at last, his pulse thrumming in his ears, and saw her still standing there, exactly as she had appeared through the lens, unflinching, basket dangling loosely as though forgotten. He took a step forward before realizing what he was doing, curiosity stronger than fear. But the moment his boot touched the rail, a sound broke the silence, a long, low horn, stretched and mournful, vibrating through the iron beneath his feet. His head snapped toward the horizon, heart hammering. The tracks were empty, rusted, incapable of carrying anything, yet the sound swelled, filling the landscape with a resonance too powerful to be imagination. When he looked back, the girl had not moved, yet the basket at her side shifted slightly, as if stirred by unseen hands. Petals dark, crumpled, still impossibly bright against the dusk, spilled onto the rail, fluttering like scraps of fabric in the wind. Michael's stomach tightened. He raised the camera again, almost against his will, and pressed the shutter once more. The frame clicked into permanence, and in that instant he thought he saw her expression change, the hollowness of her eyes darkening deeper, her mouth opening just enough to suggest words that did not reach his ears. The horn sounded again, closer now, heavy and insistent, and the iron beneath his boots vibrated as though an engine thundered toward him, though the line had been abandoned for years. Michael staggered backward, heart thundering. The camera clutched tight, but still he did not run. His lens remained fixed on the girl, her figure too sharp, too undeniable, every detail seared into memory. And then, as the last light bled out of the sky, she tilted her head slightly further, those eyes black as tar holding his gaze without release. And in the silence that followed the phantom horn, Michael realized the crossing had given him what he came for, an image that would haunt him longer than memory, a truth too sharp to deny. Michael retreated slowly from the tracks, his hands trembling as he lowered the camera to his chest, the strap biting into the back of his neck with the weight of it. The girl had not moved. She stood in the same place where he had first caught her through the lens, her basket tilted in her hand, the petals scattered around her shoes. The sky had darkened fully now, a thin violet seam at the horizon bleeding into the black of oncoming night, and the silence pressed close again, dense and expectant, as if everything beyond the rails had stopped breathing. His throat ached with the effort of swallowing. The metallic tang of cold filled his mouth, and still he could not look away. Slowly, almost without thought, he lifted the camera again and pressed the playback button, his thumb unsteady as the screen flickered to life. The small digital display glowed faintly in the dusk, showing him the photograph he had just taken, the rails stretching into the horizon, the girl in her pale dress standing in the center. He exhaled shakily, convinced that what he saw must be the product of fatigue, the mind catching shapes where there were none. But then he noticed it. At first it was only a shadow, a blur behind her, so faint he thought it was an artifact of the lens, a trick of the failing light. But as he stared, the shape resolved, shifting almost imperceptibly within the frame. There, just over her shoulder, half shrouded in the dark, was the outline of a face. Not hers, not his reflection. Something else older, drawn, the skin creased and stretched, lips pulled tight across teeth that did not belong in a child's picture. The eyes stared directly into the camera, into him, not black voids like the girl's, but pale, gleaming, wet, the gaze of something caught in the instant of intrusion. Michael's breath hitched sharply. He jerked his head up, the screen slipping against his palm. The girl still stood before him, basket in hand, but now she seemed nearer, though he could not remember her moving. The space between them closed as though the rails had shortened. He wanted to call out, to demand explanation, but his voice failed him, throat constricting against sound. He lifted the camera again, desperate to see if the face remained, but before he could press the button, the sound returned. The horn. This time it was not distant, not a whisper carried by memory, but full and resonant, bursting against the night with the force of iron and steam. It vibrated through his chest, rattling his bones, echoing across the empty fields with a command that made the air shiver. Michael staggered back a step, heart thundering. His boots caught on the gravel and he nearly fell, his eyes snapping down to the rails beneath him. They were shaking. The rusted lines, long dead, shivered violently against the wooden ties, the stones quivering as if beneath the passage of tremendous weight. The sound of wheels, steel grinding against steel, roared from the horizon. Too real, too immediate to be mistaken for memory now. His pulse spiked. He backed away further, lifting the camera instinctively even as terror blurred his vision. Through the lens, the girl remained, her figure rigid in the center of the tracks, head tilted, eyes still void and endless, her dress whipping faintly in the phantom wind of the oncoming train. Michael's mouth opened on a warning, but the words caught in his throat, lost beneath the deafening rush of sound. He stumbled further off the line, his body trembling with the instinct to flee, yet his fingers betrayed him, tightening on the shutter, capturing frame after frame even as the rails screamed with the approach of something that should not exist. The horizon bloomed with light, searing and sudden, not the soft yellow of a distant village, but the harsh white glare of a train's headlamp, cutting through snow and dark, bearing down on him with the inevitability of history repeating. The girl did not move, her basket tilted, spilling its last petals onto the rails, and as Michael snapped one final image he saw, not through the viewfinder but with his own failing eyes, another figure materializing at her side. It was not the face from before, not merely an outline this time, but the full form of a woman bent with age, her features drawn and severe, her eyes fixed on him with a ferocity that pierced deeper than fear. She leaned forward as though pressing against the boundary of the photograph itself, her hand reaching not for the girl but toward him, fingers stretched, nails long and sharp, the movement fluid and deliberate. The train's roar filled the night, thunder and steel collapsing into a single note that split the sky. Michael dropped the camera and turned, sprinting from the rails, his legs heavy as though the air itself resisted his escape. The ground trembled violently, dust and stones rising, the crossing sign clattering against its chain, and behind him the glare of the headlamp spread wider, hotter, brighter, until the entire landscape seemed to wash in its blinding light. He stumbled across the ditch, collapsing to his knees, clutching at the earth with shaking hands as the horn bellowed one last time, rattling his ribs, leaving him gasping in its wake. And then silence. He forced his eyes open. The horizon was dark again. The rails lay rusted, still, unmoved. The light was gone. The air once more calm. No sign of any passing engine. The only sound was his own breath, ragged and desperate, scraping the back of his throat. Slowly, he turned toward the tracks. The girl was gone. The basket remained, lying on its side, a few withered petals scattered in the gravel, and beside it, half buried in shadow, was the camera he had dropped. Its lens reflected the faintest glimmer of dying daylight, and though every instinct told him not to, Michael crawled forward, trembling, and lifted it again. The screen flickered on, showing the last frame it had captured the girl on the rails, her hollow eyes fixed, and behind her the old woman's face pressed close, her gaze sharper now, her mouth curved in something that might have been a smile, though it bared too many teeth to belong to anything human. Michael's vision swam. He staggered to his feet, clutching the camera against his chest, and for the first time since arriving, he felt the undeniable certainty that the crossing was no longer abandoned, that its silence was not emptiness but invitation, and that whatever stories the town had whispered were far less than the truth waiting here. Michael stumbled away from the crossing, his boots sliding against the uneven ground, the weight of the camera dragging at his shoulder as if it were no longer an object but a burden alive and resisting. His breath tore ragged through the cold air, each exhale rising in frantic clouds that dissolved before his eyes. And yet, no matter how far he pulled himself from the rails, he felt the tremor of them still, faint and constant. as though his very bones had learned their rhythm. The fields around him stretched wide and indifferent, but the night no longer felt empty. It felt occupied, filled with a presence that walked at his side just out of sight. Keeping pace with his hurried steps, he forced himself to stop beneath the skeletal shape of a dead tree, one hand braced against its bark, his chest burning, his vision blurred by exhaustion and fear. The camera hung heavy at his hip, the strap twisted tight across his body, and despite every instinct telling him to abandon it, he could not, because within its memory lay proof of what he had seen. Proof meant safety, he told himself, as though a captured image could tether horror into something explainable. He lifted the device with shaking hands, pressed the playback button again, and stared into the glow of the small screen. The image blinked alive. The girl, the tracks, the basket overturned at her feet. But as the seconds stretched, he realized the photograph was not still. The pixels seemed to ripple faintly, shadows crawling at the edges of the frame. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. The girl's head tilted slowly, so slow he might have mistaken it for imagination, until her hollow eyes turned once more toward him, across the barrier of the screen. Behind her, the outline of the old woman leaned closer, sharper, her face pressed against the invisible boundary of the lens, her mouth moving, though no sound escaped. Michael dropped the camera against his chest, his heart stuttering, bile rising in his throat. He wanted to smash it against the ground, to rid himself of the image forever, but his fingers clung to it with desperate strength, as if destroying the device would only release what it contained. His eyes darted toward the crossing, hoping, praying to see nothing, but there in the center of the rails the basket remained upright again, no longer overturned, resting neatly as though placed by careful hands. A thin scattering of petals lay around it, though now they looked brittle, darkened, almost crumbled with age. He froze, every muscle seized, watching the basket as the wind shifted around it. For a moment he thought it might be empty, but then something inside stirred a faint rustle, a shift of shadow that suggested more than flowers. His vision tunneled, the cold biting so deep he no longer felt his fingertips, and the voice came, not from the air around him but from within, low and resonant, the same mournful tone as the train's horn, speaking not in words but in command. Stay. Michael tore himself backward, stumbling, nearly falling into the ditch as he forced his body to move against the weight of the sound. His boots struck the road that led back toward town, and for a moment he thought he had escaped. That distance might break the tether, but with each step he felt the presence drawing closer, woven now not into the tracks but into him, threaded through his pulse, his breath, his sight. He glanced down at the camera swinging against his chest, and in the reflection of the dark glass lens he thought he saw a face looking back. Not his own, not entirely human, eyes hollow and infinite. The road stretched ahead in silence, but behind him, the faint scrape of petals against gravel lingered, a sound too delicate for the wind, steady, deliberate, as though the basket were being carried once more. Michael ran then, the camera clutched tight, his footsteps loud against the frozen earth, the night swallowing him, and still the weight of the photograph pressed against his chest, a reminder that what he had seen was not confined to the rails, not bound to the place of its death, but carried forward in every image he had taken, following him now, frame by frame, step by step, until there would be nowhere left to go. Michael did not remember how long he ran. The road blurred beneath his boots, the trees on either side bending and warping into dark silhouettes that seemed to lean toward him as he passed. His chest burned, his breath tearing through his throat in shallow bursts, his hands clamped around the camera, as if it were both anchor and curse. He told himself over and over that if he just reached the town, if he could place even a single wall between himself and the rails, the weight pressing on him would lift. But the further he moved from the crossing, the more he realized the road offered no safety. The presence had not stayed behind. It had moved with him, braided into the rhythm of his heartbeat, stitched into the corners of his vision. By the time the faint glow of the town appeared at the horizon, Michael's legs felt hollow, and yet a strange calm descended on him, like the lull of exhaustion before collapse. He slowed to a walk, each step deliberate, each breath drawn as though he were afraid of what might fill his lungs. He dared a glance at the camera's screen again, and for a moment the display was blank, black, reflecting only his drawn face and the hollow of his eyes. Relief threatened to break through him until the glow flickered alive. Unbidden, the photograph surfacing without his touch. It was the girl once more, standing on the tracks with the basket in her hand. But this time she was not alone. The old woman behind her had stepped forward, her face no longer blurred by distance, the deep lines of her skin etched sharp against the failing light. Her mouth was parted in something between a smile and a grimace, and though the photograph was still, Michael swore he saw her hand lift, extending beyond the frame, reaching toward him with fingers too long, nails catching the faint gleam of the screen. He flinched, nearly dropping the device, but his grip remained locked, knuckles pale. The image pulsed faintly, as if the photograph itself were breathing. He snapped the camera shut, shoved it against his chest, and stumbled forward into town. The streets were empty, the windows dark, only the dim glow of a single street lamp painting the cobblestones in amber. He leaned against it, bending double, dragging air into his lungs. For a fleeting moment he believed he had outrun whatever followed, that he was safe here, in the human spaces of light and stone. But then he heard it, the faint scrape of something delicate against the pavement, a sound far too fragile for boots. He turned his head slowly, dread thickening his stomach. There it was, the basket. It sat at the end of the street, upright, its handle tilted toward him, petals scattered loosely around its base. They looked older now, dried and brittle, fragments that crumbled as the wind stirred them. But the basket itself was whole, impossibly clean, as though it had only just been placed there. He blinked hard, rubbed at his eyes, but when he looked again it remained. The same faint scrape came again, though it had not moved. His heart lurched. The scrape wasn't from the basket shifting, it was from the sound of petals dragging themselves forward, inch by inch, across the ground. Michael backed against the wall of the nearest building, his body trembling. He wanted to scream for help, to pound on doors, to wake the town, but his voice caught, locked in his chest. Instead, he raised the camera one more time, his hand shaking, and lifted it toward the street. The lens framed the basket neatly in the center, the petals around it forming a pale circle. He pressed the shutter. The screen blinked. The image appeared. At first, it was only what he had seen: the basket, the petals, the dim amber glow. But then the frame darkened, the shadows deepening, and there she was again, the girl, standing behind the basket, her hollow eyes fixed directly on him. The old woman loomed behind her, her face pressed so close to the lens that the photograph seemed to bulge outward. Her mouth twisted, her teeth visible in the pale wash of light. Michael's pulse thundered. He dropped the camera against his chest, eyes snapping upward to the street. Empty. Only the basket, only the petals. But the feeling of being seen, of being claimed, was absolute now. He stumbled into the inn where he had left his bag, fumbling with the keys, slamming the door behind him, bolting it shut. The room felt suffocating, the single lamp casting too much shadow, and still he could not put the camera down. He sat on the edge of the bed, clutching it, staring at the floorboards until his vision blurred. He told himself he would leave in the morning, that he would take the first bus out, burn the film, throw the device into the deepest river he could find. But when exhaustion finally dragged him down, when his head fell heavy against the pillow, the last thing he saw was the reflection of the lens in the mirror opposite his bed, and in that reflection, two hollow eyes opening slowly in the glass. Morning did not save him. The basket was waiting at the threshold of the inn, upright, petals scattered across the doorway as though marking a path. The innkeeper swore no one had entered, that no one could have placed it there. Michael lifted it with trembling hands, felt the rough wicker press against his skin, and knew then that leaving would not matter. The crossing had followed him. It was inside the camera, inside the photographs, inside him. He left town that day, but the curse traveled too, in every picture he took afterward. No matter the subject, there were always shadows at the edges, outlines that blurred into the form of a girl with a basket or the face of an old woman leaning close. Sometimes they were faint, hidden in the corners of windows or in the dark between trees. Sometimes they were clearer, unmistakable, staring out at him from the frame. He tried to show others, but the images never stayed. When another person looked, the photograph was empty, only landscape, only light. Yet when Michael lifted the camera again, When his own eyes met the screen, they were there, patient, watching. The weight of the basket remained with him. He began to dream of petals scattering across his floor, of footsteps pacing beside his bed. He would wake to find them dried fragments of flowers, pale and brittle, scattered on the sheets though no window had been opened, though no bouquet had been brought inside. He swept them away, burned them, buried them, but always they returned, marking the quiet reminder that he was not alone. And in time, Michael stopped taking photographs, not because he no longer believed in the power of the camera, but because he understood that every frame, every shutter, was another doorway for them to step through. He locked the device away, buried it deep in a trunk, and told himself that if he never touched it again, he might finally be free. But freedom never came, for the crossing had not chosen the camera, it had chosen him. And though the rails lay rusted, though the station rotted and the trains no longer ran, the echo of the horn still lived in his chest. And sometimes, at night, when the world was quiet and the air pressed cold against the window, Michael swore he heard it again, long and mournful, a promise that the journey was not over, that the rails led not away but inward, and that one day soon, when he raised his eyes, he would see them waiting, basket in hand, face at his shoulder, ready to claim the space he had carried for them all along. The grandson's return. David had not planned to stay long. The house had grown heavy in her absence, shutters sagging on their hinges, the smell of dust and old wood clinging to every room. And yet when his mother called and said it was time to see her, that his grandmother's health was slipping faster than expected, he packed a small bag and boarded the train back to the town he thought he had left behind for good. The house waited at the end of the lane, the same house he had run through as a boy, now sagging into itself, curtains drawn, the garden overgrown with weeds that rattled in the wind. Inside it was dim, the air thick with the scent of camphor and old fabric, and his grandmother lay curled beneath quilts in the bedroom where sunlight barely reached. Her eyes had lost their sharpness years ago, her mind slipping in and out of names and days, her words reduced to murmurs that did not always belong to the present. David sat by her bed, adjusting pillows, coaxing her to sip water, his own voice softer than he remembered it being, as though the house demanded quiet. The clock ticked on the dresser, a slow metronome marking time she no longer followed. For hours, nothing changed. She dozed, stirred, muttered fragments of half-remembered prayers. David found his thoughts drifting, wondering why the walls felt so close, why the air pressed heavier in this room than in any other. The evening deepened, shadows stretched across the floorboards, and he had just reached for the lamp when his grandmother's body jolted upright, sudden and sharp, as though a string had been pulled from within her chest. Her eyes were open wide now, glistening, unclouded in a way he had not seen in years. Her lips parted, and from her throat rose a sound that did not belong to her, a voice strong, resonant, soaring upward into a melody he did not recognize. It was opera, an old style, the cadence rolling with words he could not quite place, but the force of it shook him. The room vibrated with sound, the fragile frame of her body belying the power that poured from it, every note threaded with a grief so raw it cut through him. David froze in his chair, hands gripping the armrest, his skin prickling. His grandmother had never sung, not in his memory, not in anyone's memory. Her voice always soft, worn, too thin for music, yet now she sang as though she had carried this song for centuries. The vowels stretched long and mournful, the consonants sharp with longing. He felt the weight of something older than her moving through the sound, something that had borrowed her lungs for its lament. When the final note faded, she turned her head toward him with a slowness that chilled him, and her lips curled into a smile too wide, too deliberate, the kind of smile that belonged to no photograph he had ever seen of her. For an instant, her eyes glittered as though someone else peered out through them, and in the silence that followed, she let out a soft laugh, brittle and sharp, before sinking back against the pillows with a sigh. Her chest rose and fell in shallow rhythm once more, her face slackening into the familiar confusion of age. But the echo of that song lingered in the air, vibrating in his bones, and David realized he was trembling, unable to shake the sense that another presence had been in the room with them, one that had not yet left. The night after the song, David could not sleep. He sat in the kitchen with the lamp turned low, the walls sighing with the weight of the house, and every sound unsettled him, the groan of wood in the rafters, The uneven tick of the clock, the occasional whisper of wind against the shutters that sounded too close, too human. Each time he closed his eyes, he heard her voice again, rising from a body too frail to contain it, a melody so full of sorrow and anger that it seemed to lodge in his bones. By morning, his nerves had frayed to the point of breaking. He found himself pacing the yard, boots crunching through weeds, trying to decide if he had imagined it, if fatigue had conjured something impossible, but the memory was too sharp, too alive. It was then he remembered an old name, one his mother used to mention with half respect, half fear, a man who lived on the outskirts of town, known for rites and muttered prayers, someone people visited when the doctors could no longer explain what weighed on them. David hesitated, the rational part of him scoffing at the idea, but the image of his grandmother's twisted smile left him with little choice. He found a phone number scribbled in an old address book and called. The voice that answered was slow, deliberate, as if each word had been weighed before it left the mouth. When David stammered through his story, describing the sudden song, the laughter, the way her eyes had gleamed with something not her own, there was silence on the other end long enough for him to think the line had gone dead. Then the man spoke, his tone calm, almost weary. It is not her voice you heard. It belongs to someone who does not rest. David gripped the receiver tighter. What do you mean? The man explained that the town carried stories older than its streets, that long ago there had been a singer, a woman who traveled from village to village with nothing but her songs, performing in marketplaces and crossroads. She had died here, hungry and cold, ignored by those who owed her kindness, her body buried without rites, her possessions scattered or stolen. Her voice had lingered, tethered to places where her last songs had been sung. And sometimes, when the living weakened, she borrowed a body to finish what she had been denied to be heard, to remind, to accuse. David's throat went dry. Why my grandmother? The line crackled, the voice steady. Because she is closest. Because the spirit has chosen her. But there is more. A singer does not return without reason. If it has come into your house, it is because of something unresolved. Ask yourself, what did your grandmother keep? What did she break? What debt was left unpaid? David pressed a hand to his forehead, trying to recall, but his mind spun. His grandmother had told many stories over the years, fragments of a past he had not cared to preserve. Yet something stirred in memory, her mentioning a bowl once, a fine porcelain bowl she had broken as a girl, one that had not belonged to her family. She had spoken of it only once, dismissing it quickly, but her eyes had clouded with guilt. He swallowed hard, his voice low. There was something about a bowl. She said she broke it when she was young. The man on the line inhaled slowly, as though this confirmed what he already knew. Find it, or what is left of it. The dead cling to objects. They hold the shape of memory. If you want her peace back, you must face what she carried. The spirit is not singing for nothing. It sings to be answered. David felt the air in the kitchen tighten, as though even the walls leaned closer to hear. He thanked the man, though the words felt small against the weight of what he had been told. When he hung up the phone, the silence of the house was sharper than before, vibrating faintly, as if a voice waited just beneath it, ready to rise again. He knew then he would have to return to the past, to the stories his grandmother never finished, because the song was not over, and if he ignored it, it would only grow louder. The memory of the bowl returned to him like a shadow resurfacing from a dream. David sat at the threshold of his grandmother's room that night, listening to her uneven breathing, and little by little the fragments of a story she once told him came back into focus. She had been no more than a child when it happened, no older than 12. The town was poorer then, winters harsher, and wandering performers still drifted from village to village. One of them, a singer, had passed through her voice so powerful it seemed to carry the weight of the season itself, a gift to people who had little else. But she had been hungry, and his grandmother had been sent to carry food to her. Somewhere along the way, in her clumsiness, she had dropped the offering. The porcelain bowl shattered, the meal spoiled, and instead of confessing, she had hidden the shards in the old well at the edge of the property, pretending it had never happened. The singer died not long after. Some said it was from hunger, others from cold, others still whispered that despair had silenced her. Whatever the cause, she had been buried without ceremony, her possessions scattered, her voice left untended. And David's grandmother, whether from guilt, fear, or or denial had carried that memory all her life, buried deeper than the shards themselves. Now, as he sat in the dim silence of the house, the memory pulsed with a new, unbearable weight. The next morning, he called the spiritual practitioner again. The man agreed to come. His presence was unassuming, his coat plain, but his eyes carried the quiet certainty of someone who had stood often at the border between the living and the restless dead. He did not waste time with pleasantries. Instead, after listening to David's halting retelling, he asked to see the well. Together they walked across the yard, weeds brushing at their legs, until they reached the far corner where the well sagged into earth. Moss coated the stones, the wooden cover soft with rot. When the man lifted it, the smell of damp earth and something older rose up, a draft that seemed to whisper from the dark throat below. David fetched a lantern, lowering its weak glow down into the shaft. The light caught on something pale and jagged at the bottom, flashes like teeth scattered in the mud. They tied a rope around his waist, and though dread crawled through him, David lowered himself into the shaft. The stones were slick, water cold against his boots, and by the time he reached the bottom, his fingers were trembling. He knelt in the muck, the lantern swaying above, and began to dig with his hands. The soil clung to him, bitter and wet, but soon his fingertips scraped against something hard. He pulled it free, a shard of porcelain, white dulled by decades, but with faint blue paint still clinging to one edge. He turned it in his palm, the edges sharp enough to cut, the surface faintly stained with something the earth had not erased. His breath caught. He dug further, finding more, gathering them one by one until his pockets sagged heavy with fragments. When he climbed back up, the practitioner laid the pieces on a cloth and studied them with solemn care. Without a word, he began arranging an offering on the ground: incense, folded paper, coins for the restless. His chant rose low and steady, words threaded in a cadence older than David's memory of the town, carrying with them the weight of ritual. The fire took slowly, smoke coiling upward, and as it thickened, David thought he heard something else threading through it. A melody, faint at first, then swelling the same song his grandmother had sung. Only now it came not from her lips, but from the air itself, from the shards gleaming faintly as though they held a memory too sharp to die. The voice was mournful, but laced with fury, every note edged with a demand. David's skin prickled, tears rising unbidden as though his body knew it was guilty too. The practitioner's voice grew stronger, his chant pushing back against the rising song, steady and unwavering. The fire cracked, sparks lifting, the paper offerings collapsing into ash. For a moment the two sounds clashed, grief and ritual folding together into something unbearable. Then, with a sudden hiss, the porcelain trembled and fell still, the faint glow in their edges extinguishing as though doused. The melody stopped mid-phrase, cut off, leaving only silence. David's chest heaved as though he had been running. He stared at the black mouth of the well, its darkness heavier now for the secret it had released. The air around him felt lighter, the yard less suffocating, but he could not convince himself it was over. The singer's voice had not faded, it had been silenced, hushed by ritual, pressed back into sleep, and deep in his chest, he knew sleep was never the same as peace. The fire burned lower, the incense collapsing into thin lines of ash, and the chanting slowed, each syllable falling into the silence like a stone dropped into still water. David knelt on the ground beside the cloth where the shards lay, his hands raw from the digging, his eyes fixed on the porcelain pieces, as though they might stir again. The yard smelled of smoke and damp soil, sharp and acrid, and for a long time the only sound was the faint hiss of the offerings consuming themselves. When the final thread of flame died, the practitioner pressed his palms together, his face turned toward the well. His lips moved one last time, a whisper too soft for David to catch, and then he turned his gaze to him. "It is done," he said quietly, but there was no triumph in his voice, only the measured fatigue of someone who had carried such burdens before. "The debt has been acknowledged. The bowl has been given back." David nodded, his throat too tight to speak. The ground beneath him no longer felt weighted, yet he could not shake the feeling that the night itself was listening, waiting. He helped gather the ashes, the scattered coins, the cloth now streaked with soot. When they had finished, the practitioner placed the shards into a small wooden box, sealing it with careful hands. "Keep them safe," he instructed, "not as relics, but as memory." The dead do not ask to be forgotten. They only ask to be seen. Tonight she has been seen. M. The words lodged in David's chest, heavier than the box itself. He thanked the man, though gratitude felt too fragile, too incomplete. Together they walked back toward the house. The windows glowed faintly, the lamplight inside thin and wavering. For the first time since arriving, David dreaded stepping through the door. The practitioner stopped at the threshold. "She will wake soon," he murmured. "But what she has carried may not vanish. Be ready to listen." David entered alone. The house greeted him with its familiar hush, though the air was softer now, as if the walls had exhaled. He moved to the bedroom, the box pressed tight against his side. His grandmother lay where he had left her, still beneath the quilt, her breath shallow but steady. He pulled the chair closer and sat, the weight of hours dragging at his shoulders. Minutes passed. Then her eyelids fluttered. At first he thought it was the twitch of a dream, but slowly, haltingly, her eyes opened. They were clearer than he expected, the cloudy film of age thinner, the focus sharp enough to find him. She blinked once, twice, and then her lips moved. Her voice was weak, rasping with thirst, but the words were deliberate. "I dreamed," she whispered. David leaned close. "What did you see?" Her gaze shifted, distant, as though she were still half in the dream. "A woman," she said. She was singing with eyes that never closed. Her voice filled everything. And she looked at me. She looked at me like she had been waiting all these years. There was hunger in her, and anger, and she asked me why I had left her empty. David's chest tightened. He reached for her hand, the skin paper-thin and cold. "You don't have to carry it anymore," he murmured. "We found the bowl. We gave it back." But she did not seem to hear him. Her lips trembled, and a faint laugh rose from her throat, brittle and broken. "She knows me," she said. "She will not forget. Even in sleep, she will not forget." Her eyes closed again, exhaustion pulling her under. But her grip tightened briefly on his fingers, a pressure too firm for her frail body, as if someone else's strength had surged through her. Then it eased, and she drifted back into shallow breathing. David sat rigid in the chair, the words echoing in his head. He glanced at the box of shards resting on the table, the faint smell of smoke still clinging to it. He imagined the fragments shifting inside, whispering against one another, holding the memory of a voice that had not truly been silenced. Outside, the wind lifted, carrying with it a faint vibration, almost like a note stretched thin, a thread of melody too fragile to be certain of. He told himself it was only the house, only the night. But when he closed his eyes, the sound rose again, carrying with it a pair of eyes he had never seen but could not forget, eyes that burned through dreams with the fury of the forgotten. The days that followed slipped by like water over stone, but the house did not feel cleansed. The air was lighter, yes, but it was a fragile kind of lightness, like a room that has been hastily aired after years of being locked. David rose each morning to find his grandmother awake, clearer than before, sometimes able to recall his name, sometimes able to take food without coaxing. Yet at night her eyes clouded again, and she muttered fragments of that melody, a line here, a sigh there, as if the song had not left her throat completely. He tried to reassure himself that the ritual had worked, that the voice had been answered, but unease threaded through everything. The wooden box remained on the dresser, the shards inside shifting softly whenever the house settled, though he told himself it was only his imagination. Once, in the early hours, he swore he heard porcelain clink faintly together, as though stirred by unseen hands. The practitioner had told him the spirit had been seen, the dead acknowledged, yet he had not said the word forgiven. On the third night, David woke from a shallow doze to the sound of his grandmother's laughter. It was low and broken, but unmistakably hers, though threaded with something else, an echo too sharp, too foreign. He sat up quickly, his heart pounding, and saw her staring at the ceiling with eyes wide open, lips moving in silence. When he leaned closer, he caught a word, repeated again and again: hungry. The following morning, when he stepped outside to clear his head, he found something waiting in the yard. Scattered across the grass were petals withered, dry, brittle as ash, yet unmistakably fresh in their arrangement, as though someone had laid them there with care. He bent to touch one, and it crumbled instantly between his fingers, leaving only dust. The wind shifted, carrying a sound so faint he could not tell if it was memory or air. A single sustained note, a fragment of song curling around his ears. That night he dreamed of the well. He stood at its edge, looking down into its throat, but instead of darkness there was light, soft, white, and pulsing, as if the shards below were glowing once more. From that glow a woman's silhouette emerged, her mouth open in endless song, her eyes locked upward at him. He tried to wake but could not, his body pinned by the melody. Only when her hand reached toward the rim, stretching impossibly long, did he jolt awake, soaked in sweat, his chest aching as though he had been holding his breath for hours. In the dim light of dawn, he sat in the bedroom again, watching his grandmother sleep, and realized the truth he had been avoiding. What had been bound was not gone. The spirit had been quieted. Yes, but silence is not the same as surrender. It had pressed its memory into the shards, into the house, into their bloodline, and it would wait patient, unyielding, until the chance to rise again. David looked at the box one last time. The wood seemed darker now, the air around it colder. He thought of carrying it to the river, of sinking it in the deepest water he could find, but as he reached for it, his grandmother stirred, her lips parting to whisper the first note of that same forgotten song, and his hand froze. Because he knew then that no matter how far he carried the shards, no matter how deep he buried them, the song was already inside them both, and some voices, once heard, do not let go. The empty well. The house had been empty for years before they arrived, its shutters warped from rain, its walls veined with ivy, the yard overgrown with tall grass that bent and hissed when the wind moved through it. Leo and Finn had not minded. They were twins, 14 years old, restless and curious, and the strangeness of the place only sharpened their sense of adventure. Their parents were still busy unpacking boxes, stacking dishes in cupboards, arguing quietly about the electricity. So the boys claimed the yard as theirs and ran through it with the reckless energy of youth. It was then they found the well. It sat behind the house, half hidden beneath an oak that leaned heavily to one side, its trunk scarred with deep grooves, as though someone had once tied chains around it. The stones of the well were blackened with age, the mortar crumbling, the wooden cover split in two and sagging across the mouth like broken teeth. A rope dangled uselessly from the old pulley, frayed and stiff, long since snapped at the end. The boys circled it at first with a kind of delighted caution, their shoes crunching over gravel. Finn dropped a pebble inside and leaned close to listen. The sound of it falling seemed to take too long, the silence stretching until he almost thought the stone would never land. Then plunk, the faint splash echoed upward, hollow and strange. Still water down there, Finn said, straightening, brushing dust from his palms. Probably 30 feet at least. Leo grinned. His reflection in the shallow puddle that clung to the edge of the cover looked sharper than Finn's, as if the well itself preferred him. We should climb down someday. Or, Finn said dryly, we should not die in the first week of living here. They laughed, the sound carrying into the woods. For days the well remained only a curiosity. They played their usual games around it, racing to see who could sprint from the back door and touch the stone lip first, daring each other to lean further over the edge, peering into the shadows. Their parents warned them half-heartedly to stay away, but warnings only gave it weight. One afternoon, when the sun was lowering and the air thick with the scent of damp leaves, they began a game of hide-and-seek. Finn pressed his forehead to the trunk of the oak, counting loudly, while Leo darted across the yard searching for a place to vanish. The shed was too obvious, the brush pile too thin. His eyes drifted toward the well. The cover had shifted slightly in the breeze, leaving a narrow gap wide enough for him to peer through. He crouched, pressing his face to the opening, holding his breath. That was when he saw it. At the bottom, far below, something glimmered. It was faint, pulsing faintly like a living thing, but distinct enough that he knew it wasn't imagination. A shard of light, bluish, greenish, hard to define, glowing against the water's black surface. His heart lurched, curiosity burning through him. Finn, he called. His voice hushed despite himself. Come here. His brother turned, eyes narrowing, but Leo was already pointing. Together they leaned over the well, their shoulders brushing. The glow wavered below, flickering like a jewel sunk in darkness. It's a stone, Leo said. Or glass. Something. Look at it. Finn frowned. It's just water catching the light. There's no light down there. Then it's your eyes playing tricks. Finn stepped back quickly, rubbing his arms. The air felt colder now, as though the well breathed against them. Don't mess with it. Leo stayed where he was, staring. The light seemed to grow stronger the longer he looked, a slow throb that matched the pace of his own heartbeat. It seemed to call to him, a silent pulse at the bottom of the earth. Waiting, his fingers gripped the stone lip of the well, and he found himself leaning further than before, his reflection bending and distorting in the dark water. Finn tugged at his sleeve, uneasy. Come on, it's your turn to hide. But Leo barely heard him. The glow below pulsed again, brighter this time, as if answering his gaze. He whispered, not even meaning to, "It's beautiful." Finn shivered. The shadows stretched longer across the yard, the oak creaking above them. For the first time since they had moved in, he wished the well had been filled and sealed long ago. The thought of the glowing stone would not leave Leo. All night it pulsed behind his eyes, a memory sharper than sleep. He lay awake listening to the house settle, to the faint creak of beams and the hush of the trees outside, and still he saw it faint, alive, waiting for him at the bottom of the well. By morning he had decided he would go down and bring it up. Finn knew something was wrong the moment his brother spoke. They were sitting on the back steps, the grass still damp from dawn, their parents inside unpacking another set of boxes. Leo's eyes were too bright, his voice too quick. "I can get it," he said, as if the decision had already been made. "There's still rope on the pulley. We can tie it off to the tree." Finn shook his head instantly. "That rope's rotted. It'll snap before you're halfway down. And even if it doesn't, you don't know what's at the bottom. The water could be deep. You could drown." "I saw it," Leo insisted, leaning forward, his voice low but fierce. "It's real. A stone, a jewel, something. Why else would it shine? It's not just water. It's not just light. It's waiting for me." The words chilled Finn. It wasn't just what Leo said, it was the way he said it. As though the glow had spoken to him. As though he had been chosen. Finn tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in his throat. The yard around them seemed too still, the air too heavy. "Forget it," he muttered. "Let it rot down there." But Leo did not forget. That afternoon, when the shadows stretched long across the grass, he returned to the well. Finn followed reluctantly, trying to talk him out of it, but his words scattered against his brother's determination. Leo had already found a coil of newer rope in the shed, stiff but sturdy enough, and he looped it through the pulley with quick, practiced hands. His fingers trembled not with fear but with anticipation. Finn hovered at his side, stomach tight. "Don't do this. Please, there's nothing down there worth it." Leo only smiled, his eyes fixed on the dark circle of the well. "Then it'll be easy. I'll go down. I'll see nothing, and I'll climb back up. But if it's there..." He did not finish. He didn't need to. Finn watched helplessly as his twin tested the rope, tugging it hard, then braced one foot on the stone lip. The well seemed to breathe beneath him, exhaling a draft so cold it made Finn's skin pebble. He shivered violently, backing away a step, but the chill did not lessen. It wrapped around him, slipping beneath his shirt, into his lungs, a cold deeper than winter. He opened his mouth to warn Leo, but the words stuck, trapped in his throat. Then he heard it, a voice. It came from far below, rising faint and hollow through the shaft. His own name carried upward as though the stones themselves had spoken it. Finn. The syllable stretched, thin but unmistakable. His stomach dropped. He glanced at Leo, but his brother was too focused on the rope, too intent on lowering himself in, to notice. Finn. Again louder now, closer, yet still not quite human. The edges of the sound blurred like water rushing over stone. He staggered back, heart pounding, scanning the yard, the trees, the house. There was no one, only the well, its darkness yawning wide, the voice spilling from it in waves. Panic surged through him. He lunged forward, grabbing Leo's arm just as his brother lifted his other leg to step fully onto the rim. "Stop," he shouted, his voice cracking. Leo turned, startled, eyes wild. For a heartbeat, Finn thought he would resist, thought he would shove him away. But something in Finn's face, the raw terror there, froze him. They struggled at the edge, the rope swaying, the pulley creaking. For one awful moment, Finn felt the weight shift, felt his brother's balance tilt toward the darkness. and his chest constricted with the certainty that he was about to lose him. He pulled harder, muscles straining, teeth clenched, until Leo stumbled backward, collapsing onto the grass. They both lay there gasping, the silence ringing with what had almost happened. The rope swayed gently, the pulley whining, as if mocking their struggle. Finn pressed his palms against the earth, shaking. He turned his head, ready to scold, ready to scream, but then he froze. Leo was not looking at him. He was staring back at the well. His twin's eyes were glassy, unfocused, fixed on something only he could see. His lips moved faintly, forming words Finn could not hear. It was only when the draft rose again from the well, colder than before, that Finn realized the voice had not stopped. He had silenced it with his panic, but Leo had heard it too. Finn dragged himself upright, pulling his brother away from the stones. The rope scraped against the rim as it slipped loose, falling into the shaft with a hiss. The sound seemed to echo longer than it should, as though the well were deeper now, infinite. For a long time they sat side by side in the grass, not speaking, the twilight thickening around them. Finn could not bring himself to ask what Leo had heard. He was too afraid of the answer. And yet, in the pit of his stomach, he knew this was only the beginning. That night the house seemed to breathe differently. The walls, still strange to them after only a few days of living there, held a weight that pressed against the edges of every room. Their parents had gone to bed early, worn thin from the unpacking, leaving Leo and Finn alone in the upstairs room they shared. The window faced the yard, and from where their beds were set against opposite walls, they could see the silhouette of the oak tree swaying above the well. They had not spoken much after the incident in the yard. Finn could not stop replaying the moment the way Leo had swayed over the lip, the rope slipping, the icy draft crawling across his skin. He wanted to demand answers, to ask what his brother had heard, but whenever he tried, the words dried in his throat. He was afraid that saying it aloud would give it power. Leo had been quiet too, but not in the same way. His silence was sharper, restless. Finn noticed how his brother's eyes lingered on the window, how his fingers drummed against his thigh as though caught in some unheard rhythm. The clock downstairs chimed 11. The house fell into that peculiar stillness that comes just before sleep, when the air itself seems to wait. Finn had almost drifted off when he heard it, a whisper. At first he thought it was the wind sliding through the oak, but the sound pressed closer, curling beneath the glass of the window. His name, Finn. The syllable stretched, a ghost of breath against the pane. His eyes snapped open. He held still, listening. Then it came again, this time softer, almost coaxing. Leo. He sat upright, heart hammering. Across the room, Leo was already awake, his head turned toward the window, eyes wide in the dim light. They exchanged a glance, wordless, then both turned their gaze toward the glass. The whispers thickened, overlapping, impossible to separate into one voice or two. The sound was wet somehow, like words spoken through water, each syllable carrying a gurgle that set Finn's teeth on edge. He wanted to call for their parents, but something in the tone patient, insistent froze him where he Saturday. The curtains stirred though the window was closed. Finn forced himself to stand, legs weak, and stepped toward the glass. Outside, the yard was drowned in shadow. The well sat in its usual place, the oak bowing over it, unmoving. Nothing stirred, but as he leaned closer, his own reflection shimmered faintly, distorted by the glass. And then he realized it wasn't only his reflection. Two faces looked back at him. They were boys, close to his own age, their features softened by the pale smear of moonlight. Their skin was gray, waterlogged, hair clinging damp against their skulls. Their eyes were too wide, staring with a glassy shine that reflected no light. One lifted a hand slowly, pressing it against the other side of the window, and Finn's stomach dropped when he saw droplets sliding down its wrist as though it still dripped with well water. "Leo," the other whispered, his mouth moving though the sound came from everywhere at once. "Come back." Finn stumbled backward, colliding with his bed frame. His breath tore ragged from his throat, and he turned to his brother for help. But Leo was already standing, drawn to the window like a moth to a flame. His face was pale, his eyes locked on the two figures beyond the glass, unblinking. He stepped closer and closer still, until his breath fogged the pain between them. Finn lunged, grabbing his arm. "Don't," he hissed, but Leo didn't answer. His body trembled under Finn's grip, not with fear but with something like yearning. Outside, the drowned boys lifted their hands in unison, beckoning. Their lips curled into faint smiles, cracked and uneven, as if their skin had forgotten how to stretch that way. "You saw it," they whispered. "You found it. It's ours now. Come." The glass shimmered, as if it might give way. For one dizzying instant, Finn thought the boys were inside already, their wet breath against his cheek, their cold fingers reaching. He pulled Leo hard, forcing him back from the window. They fell together onto the floor, the impact loud enough to echo through the room. The whispers snapped off at once, leaving only silence. When Finn dared to look again, the window showed nothing but the yard. The well was still, the oak swaying gently in the wind. His own reflection stared back at him, pale and trembling. Leo lay beside him, breathing fast, eyes unfocused. Finn shook him until he blinked, clarity seeping slowly back. Neither of them spoke. They crawled into their beds without another word, pulling the covers high, though sleep never came. For long hours they listened, waiting for the whisper to return. It never did. But in the silence, Finn could not shake the memory of those faces, pressed close against the glass, waiting with infinite patience for the moment the window might open. The days that followed stretched heavy and strange. Morning light fell across their room as though nothing had happened. Yet both boys carried the memory of the window like a bruise. Finn kept glancing toward the yard, searching for movement, for the pale shimmer of faces that might still hover just beyond the glass. Leo said little, but the silence around him was charged, restless, as though some part of him had never stepped back from the window at all. At first, Finn tried to ignore it. He buried himself in chores, unpacking boxes, wandering through the woods at the edge of the property, but the house carried the well in its bones. Every hallway seemed to tilt toward it. Every draft of cold air seemed to slip through the cracks as though pulled from its mouth. He would sit at the table with his parents, pretending to eat, while just beyond the kitchen window he swore he could hear the faint creak of the pulley shifting in a wind that wasn't there. And Leo grew stranger still. Finn caught him once standing at the back door at dusk, his hand pressed flat to the glass, eyes fixed on the shadowed yard. "I dreamed of them," he murmured when Finn pressed him. "The boys, they weren't trying to hurt us. They were only showing us the way." "And the way to what?" Finn demanded, but Leo only shook his head, lips trembling with an answer he could not or would not speak. That night, Finn woke to find Leo's bed empty. Panic surged through him, his chest tightening as he scanned the dark room. The curtains stirred faintly, though the window was shut, and when he pressed his ear to the glass, he thought he heard the faintest thread of melody, soft and wet, rising from the yard. He ran downstairs, barefoot on the cold floorboards, heart hammering, and threw open the back door. There was Leo, standing barefoot in the grass, his nightshirt clinging to him in the dew. He was staring at the well, unmoving, the oak bending overhead like a sentinel. Finn rushed to him, grabbing his shoulders, shaking him hard. "Wake up," he hissed. "You're sleepwalking." Leo blinked slowly, as if waking from a dream. His lips parted and a whisper slipped out, "It's calling." Finn dragged him back inside, trembling so hard his teeth ached, but the words lodged in his skull. "It's calling." The following evening, the pull grew stronger. Finn felt it too this time. They sat on the porch as twilight thickened, the air cooling, and the wind shifted. It came low across the grass, cold as a hand pressed against the back of the neck, and in that wind a sound rode faint, insistent. Their names: Leo, Finn. The syllables slid across the yard, weaving themselves into the shadows. They froze, eyes locked on one another, then turned slowly toward the well. It was only a dark shape beneath the oak, yet it seemed larger than before, the stones sharper, the mouth wider, breathing steadily like an open chest. Finn tried to look away, but the sound tugged at him. He felt it behind his ribs, a pulse that did not belong to him. His brother was already on his feet, moving toward it. "Stop," Finn rasped, his voice hoarse. He stumbled after him, but his legs were leaden. The grass whispered beneath their feet, carrying the sound of water sloshing far below. By the time they reached the stones, the whispers were louder, layered, impossible to count. The faces they had seen in the window seemed to hover in the dark throat of the well now, flickering in and out like reflections on water. Their pale hands beckoned, droplets falling from their wrists, their mouths moving in perfect unison. Leo leaned over the edge, his eyes wide, his face glowing faintly with the reflection of that impossible light below. "It's there," he whispered. "The jewel. They want us to see it." Finn pulled him back sharply, his nails digging into his brother's arm. "No, they don't want us to see it. They want us down there." The pulley creaked above them, though no rope hung from it now. The sound scraped across the air, rhythmic, like a bucket being drawn upward by invisible hands. Finn stared, horror twisting his stomach, as the wood groaned and the wheel spun slowly on its own. Rope fraying from nothing, twisting upward into the branches of the oak. The air grew colder, their breath fogged before them, drifting into the shaft. And then, from the depths, came a sound more terrible than the whispers. Laughter, children's laughter, hollow and wet, echoing against the stone. Leo swayed forward, caught in it, his body trembling as if something had reached into him and taken hold. Finn lunged, clutching his waist, dragging him back, but the force pulling was immense, more than Leo's thin frame could produce. It felt as though the well itself were sucking at them both, tugging at their feet, their lungs, their very names. "Let go," Leo shouted suddenly, his voice not his own, layered with another that gurgled and cracked. "You don't understand." Finn's grip only tightened. The laughter rose higher, sharper, until it fractured into a scream that cut through the night and rattled the windows of the house. The oak bent violently, its branches thrashing though no wind blew. The pulley spun faster, whining, and from the darkness below the glow pulsed bright, a sickly green light swelling like the beat of a monstrous heart. Finn pulled with all his strength, his throat raw from shouting, and at last Leo collapsed backward, the pull breaking with a shudder that knocked them both to the ground. The yard fell silent. The pulley stilled. The glow receded, sinking deeper into the throat of the earth until nothing remained but black water. They lay gasping in the grass, their hands still locked together, their bodies trembling. The night was quiet again, but the silence was not relief. It was waiting. Finn turned his head toward his brother. Leo's eyes were wide, staring not at him but at the sky above, lips moving soundlessly. Finn leaned close, straining to hear. "They said next time," Leo whispered. "Next time. We won't get away." The house felt different after that night, but not in the way Finn had hoped. It was not safer, not calmer. It was only quieter, the kind of quiet that carries a threat beneath it, like the pause between a lightning strike and the thunder that follows. Their parents never noticed. They moved through the rooms with the same distracted exhaustion, busy with work and repairs, oblivious to the way the air shifted around the boys. But Leo and Finn carried it in every breath. They avoided the yard, but even from behind closed doors they felt the well waiting, pressing at the edge of their thoughts. Leo grew pale in the days that followed. He ate little, spoke less, his eyes always sliding toward the window as if some part of him were listening to something no one else could hear. Finn tried to distract him, games, chores, even fights, but nothing broke through. Sometimes he would catch Leo's lips moving soundlessly, forming words that didn't belong to him, syllables damp and broken as though spoken through water. At night the whispers returned, not always at the window but in the corners of the room, beneath the floorboards, along the ceiling beams. Finn tried stuffing his ears with cotton, pulling the blanket over his head, but still he heard them. The voices no longer bothered to hide. They repeated the same words, over and over, in a rhythm like dripping water. Next time, next time, next time. On the third night after the struggle by the well, Finn woke to find the window open. The curtains billowed inward, the latch undone. Leo's bed was empty. His heart lurched. He ran to the window, leaning out into the chill air, and there he saw his brother, already halfway across the yard, barefoot in the grass. The oak loomed over him, the rope dangling once more from the pulley, swaying though no wind touched it. Finn's throat tightened with terror, but his body moved before his mind could. He barreled down the stairs, threw open the door, and sprinted into the yard. "Leo," he shouted, his voice breaking. Leo stopped at the lip of the well. He didn't look back. His hands hung at his sides, trembling, as though held by invisible strings. Finn reached him just in time, seizing his arm, yanking him away from the stones. For a moment, Leo resisted, his body stiff, his eyes fixed downward. Finn shouted again, shaking him hard. This time Leo blinked. Slowly, as if surfacing from a dream, he turned to his brother. His eyes were wet with tears he had not noticed falling. "I can't stop hearing them," he whispered. "They say it was us. They say we belong with them." Finn's chest ached. "They're lying. You don't belong to them. You belong here." But even as he spoke, he knew how hollow it sounded. The rope swayed above them, the pulley creaking softly, the sound threading itself into the rhythm of their hearts. From below rose the faintest glow, the color of sickly green, pulsing once, twice, like a heartbeat buried in the earth. And then the laughter came again, quiet this time, almost gentle but sharper for it, curling around them like smoke. The boys clung to each other, backing away until the grass of the yard gave way to the porch. The glow receded, the laughter fading, but the silence it left behind was heavier than before. They slept little after that. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the shutters, carried the threat of return. Their parents grew impatient with their fear, dismissing it as childish fancy. But Finn knew better. He could see the truth etched into his brother's face, in the hollowness under his eyes, in the way his hands shook when he passed too close to the window. One night, unable to bear it, Finn asked the question that had burned at him since the first whisper. "What happens if we don't go back? If we keep saying no?" Leo's expression was bleak. He looked down at his hands, twisting them together as though trying to wring out the water that wasn't there. "Then they'll come for us," he said softly. "They promised. Next time we won't be lucky." The words hung between them, heavier than the air. From then on, the boys never went near the well again. But the well did not need them to. It reached for them in other ways, through mirrors that fogged without reason, through puddles that reflected faces not their own, through dreams where cold hands closed around their wrists and pulled them down, 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 and always, just before waking, the same whisper rose, patient and certain, carrying the weight of a promise that had not yet been broken. Next time, the butcher's steak. Arthur had built his reputation on flavor. Not the kind you find in cookbooks, not the sort that can be bottled or taught, but the kind that lingers long after the meal, rising in memory when the night is quiet, gnawing at the corners of the tongue. His restaurant sat at the edge of the city, unremarkable in appearance, its sign weathered, its curtains plain. Yet every evening, the tables filled, and those who ate there spoke of it for weeks after, unable to describe why the steak was unlike any they had tasted before. Tender, rich, almost alive in the way it lingered on the palate. Arthur moved among the tables with the ease of someone who belonged to no one and nothing but his craft. He wore no apron, no uniform, only a simple white shirt with sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms strong and scarred from years at the butcher's block. His eyes were sharp but strangely distant, as though his attention was always split between the room and something unseen. When customers praised the meal, he bowed his head with quiet gratitude, but his smile never reached his eyes. That evening, the dining room hummed with its usual warmth, candles low, wine glasses gleaming, knives whispering across plates. A couple at the corner table closed their eyes after each bite, murmuring to one another with disbelief. At another table, a businessman loosened his tie, laughing too loudly, chewing too slowly, savoring each cut as though he were afraid of reaching the last piece. Arthur watched them all, his expression unreadable, and moved back toward the kitchen. It was there, in the narrow corridor that led to the coolers, that the man approached him. He was tall, dressed in a dark overcoat though the season was warm, his face half hidden in the shadow of a hat brim. Arthur noticed the details immediately, the hands too smooth for labor, the shoes polished but scuffed at the edges. The faintest trace of cologne meant to disguise something else, something metallic. The man removed his hat as he spoke, his voice measured, practiced. "I'll need a large order," he said, "for a private gathering, something that will not be forgotten." Arthur regarded him for a long moment, then asked, "How many?" 20, perhaps more." The man's eyes glinted. "And they must all taste as your steak tastes here. I trust that will not be a problem." Arthur's mouth curved slightly, though it was not a smile. "It depends," he said softly, "on whether you understand what it is you're asking for." The man leaned closer, lowering his voice until only the hiss of the kitchen's exhaust fan could cover it. "I've heard the whispers," he murmured, "that what you serve is not from cattle, that it is something else. I have no interest in the truth, only in the result." Can you provide it? Arthur's eyes flickered, just once, with something that might have been amusement or warning. He stepped back, folding his arms across his chest, and for a moment the silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then he said, "The meat I use is not from cows. That much is true. It is something rarer, something more demanding. But if you want it, if you truly want it, you must be certain. Because once you've tasted it, there is no going back." The man's lips curved faintly. "Then I want it, and I will pay." Arthur nodded slowly, his gaze dropping for an instant as though measuring the weight of the decision, the inevitability of it. Then he extended his hand, and the man shook it, the grip firm, sealing something far more binding than a business transaction. "Come back in a week," Arthur said, his voice low. "It will be ready." The man replaced his hat, turned, and left without another word, his footsteps fading into the hum of the dining room. Arthur stood in the corridor a long while after, listening to the echoes of knives on plates, the laughter of customers who would never know what they had consumed, and in the silence of his own chest he felt the faintest stirring of hunger, not theirs, but his own. Arthur had not always been a man of silence and sharp knives. Once he had been a boy, thin and restless, listening to the sound of his father's boots pacing across the floorboards, long after the lamps had been extinguished. Those boots carried more weight than they should have, each step heavy with threat, a promise that even in sleep there was no safety. His father was a butcher, the kind who worked more for coin than craft, rough with animals, rougher with people, his hands permanently stained with the memory of blood. He had a voice like a whip, cutting the air with sudden bursts of rage, and he drank until the house itself seemed to stagger under the weight of it. Arthur's earliest memories were not of lullabies or laughter, but of cold basements and the smell of iron. He remembered crouching in the corner of the slaughterhouse, watching his father lift the cleaver high and bring it down with a sound that split not only bone but also the boy's sense of what was ordinary. Meat was not meat to his father, it was conquest, proof of strength, an excuse to snarl and spit. When Arthur flinched at the sight, he was mocked. When he failed to sharpen a blade properly, he was struck. And when he cried, he was told that crying was a weakness that could be beaten out of him. The years passed, and the beatings became ritual. Arthur grew quieter, his eyes darker, his hands steadier. He learned how to cut without trembling, how to gut without gagging, how to stand still while the air filled with the stench of raw flesh. But beneath that stillness, something else was forming. Hunger. Not the hunger of the stomach, but the hunger of a boy who longed to see the balance shift, to watch the strong falter, to turn the cruelty he had endured into something he could hold in his own hands. The night it happened was ordinary, which made it all the more inevitable. His father had been drinking, the bottle clattering against the butcher's block, the room thick with the sour stench of liquor. Arthur was 16. He had sharpened the knives earlier that day, the steel ringing under his touch, each stroke of the whetstone like a prayer. His father stumbled into the room, muttering about wasted money, about how Arthur would never be a man worth his name. He raised the back of his hand, as he had so many times before. But this time, Arthur did not wait for the blow. The cleaver was already in his hand, its weight familiar, its edge bright. His body moved before his mind could catch up, a reflex born not of thought but of years of stored rage. The blade came down with a sound he knew too well, but this time it did not split bone from animal. It split silence from years of fear. His father's eyes widened, then dimmed, the strength in his body leaking away into the dirtied floor. Arthur stood over him, panting, trembling, the cleaver still raised. The room smelled the same as it always had: iron, sweat, damp wood, but now there was something else beneath it, something sharper, something almost sweet. He looked down at the body, at the man who had been the center of his fear, and felt not guilt, but an odd, hollow calm. It might have ended there, with a boy's mistake and a hurried burial, but Arthur was a butcher's son. He knew waste was a sin. He stared at the body, at the thick muscle and sinew of a man who had never gone hungry, and he thought of the meat that had passed through their table, always second-rate, always scraps. His stomach tightened with the thought, not in revulsion but in something else, something darker. By dawn, the house was filled with the smell of cooking. Arthur worked methodically, as he had seen his father do countless times, only now it was different, intimate, a reversal of roles. The skillet hissed, the fat spitting, the flesh searing into tenderness. He cut and tasted, his lips trembling as he chewed. The flavor was unlike anything he had known, richer, deeper, a taste that seemed to echo through him, filling the hollow his father had carved into his chest. It was not just food, it was power, reclamation, a new kind of inheritance. When the plate was empty, Arthur washed the pan in silence. He buried what remained of his father in the back field, the soil heavy but forgiving. No one came asking. No one cared. And in the quiet that followed, Arthur realized that he had discovered not only freedom but also a secret. Meat could carry memory. Flesh could carry meaning. And if prepared correctly, it could carry him. He never spoke of it. Years passed, and the world saw only a butcher who worked alone, who built a restaurant that grew quietly famous. But in every steak that left his kitchen, Arthur tasted again that night the moment when the cruelty ended, when fear turned into flavor. His customers did not know what lingered on their tongues, only that it haunted them, drew them back, compelled them to eat again and again. They thought it was craft. Arthur knew better. And as he stood in his kitchen years later, preparing for the stranger's order, he thought of his father's face in the moment before the blade fell, and he felt the hunger stir once more. The restaurant closed at midnight, but Arthur never left with the rest. His staff locked the doors, wiped the tables, stacked the chairs, and filed out into the dark city, leaving him alone with the lingering scent of charred meat and wine-soaked laughter. He moved slowly through the quiet kitchen, cleaning his knives, arranging them one by one in their slots, though they were already immaculate. Ritual mattered. Silence mattered. When the last light in the dining room went dark, he carried the phone from its cradle and sat at the butcher's block. His fingers hovered over the numbers, then pressed them with the same precision he used to trim fat from muscle. The line clicked. A pause. Then a voice, smooth and without introduction, slid through the receiver. "You need more." Arthur leaned back, the chair creaking faintly beneath him. "A large order," he said. "Enough for 20. Maybe more. It must be ready in a week." There was a low chuckle, soft but unsettling, as though the voice belonged to someone who always knew more than he should. Ambitious. Business must be thriving. Arthur did not answer that. He stared at the empty kitchen, the faint reflection of his own face in the steel fridge door. "The flavor must not change," he said. "They will notice. They always notice," the voice murmured. "That's why they come back. That's why you call me." Arthur's hand tightened around the receiver. For a moment he thought he heard something on the other end of the line, faint shuffling, the muffled sound of breath that did not belong to the man speaking. He closed his eyes, exhaled slowly. "Where will it come from this time?" "From where it always comes," the voice said. "From the ones no one counts. The ones who vanish into alleys, into forgotten rooms, into debts they cannot pay. The city is full of them. You know that. You've tasted it." Arthur's mouth twitched, though not in revulsion. His tongue pressed against the roof of his mouth, as if memory itself carried flavor. "It must be fresh," he whispered. "It will be." The voice shifted, as though leaning closer through the wire. "And you, Arthur? Do you ever wonder if your customers would still lick the bone clean if they knew what gave the meat its sweetness?" Arthur's eyes opened. His reflection in the fridge seemed to watch him with a patience he did not trust. "They would," he said quietly. "Hunger does not care for truth. It only cares for what fills it." The chuckle came again, lower this time, almost approving. "Then you'll have what you need." Same arrangement, same place. 3 nights from now. The line went dead. Arthur placed the receiver back in its cradle and sat motionless. The hum of the refrigerator was loud in the silence, the ticking of the wall clock impossibly slow. He rose at last and moved to the cooler. The door groaned as it opened, releasing a breath of cold air that wrapped around him like a hand. Inside, the shelves gleamed with wrapped cuts, labeled and stacked. He touched them lightly, fingertips brushing the plastic, and imagined the voices they once carried. Each had a story, each had a name, but here they were, only inventory. He closed the door, the lock snapping shut, and stood in the dark kitchen with his hands pressed flat against the cold steel. His mind wandered back not to cattle, not to the animals his father had butchered, but to the weight of his father's body beneath his knife, the first taste of meat that was not meant to be eaten. That taste had changed him, not just as a butcher, but as a man, and he knew, as he always had, that it was not the skill of his hand that drew customers. but the truth of the flesh itself. The city was hungry. He was only feeding it. Arthur turned off the last light and walked upstairs to his small apartment above the restaurant. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the window, staring down into the street. A man shuffled past, alone, his shoulders hunched, his shadow long and trembling under the dim lamps. Arthur's gaze followed him until he disappeared into the dark. He drank slowly, savoring the silence, and whispered to no one, "Not beef. Never beef." The days leading up to the banquet passed with the slow, relentless rhythm of knives against whetstone. Arthur sharpened each blade until its edge whispered against the air, tested the heft of cleavers, polished the steel counters until they gleamed like mirrors. The restaurant looked unchanged to the casual eye. The same heavy curtains, the same polished tables, the same quiet hum of preparation. But underneath, something restless simmered, as though the walls themselves anticipated what was to come. Arthur's staff noticed the change but did not speak of it. They moved carefully through the kitchen, eyes lowered, hands busy. They had worked with him long enough to know when silence was safest. Orders were clipped, movements efficient, and yet they could not ignore the way Arthur lingered too long by the cooler, or the way he inspected the back door as though waiting for a guest no one wanted to see. On the third night, the delivery came. It was not a truck, not boxes stacked high with stamped labels. It was a single van, unmarked, idling in the alley. Arthur was the only one to meet it. The staff had been dismissed early, under the pretense of repairs. He stepped into the shadowed alley with his coat collar turned up, his eyes scanning the empty street. The back doors of the van opened with a slow, deliberate creak. Inside were shapes wrapped in thick plastic, stacked carefully, too long to be anything ordinary. The air that spilled from the van was cold, metallic, tinged with something sweet and cloying. Arthur did not flinch. He only nodded. The driver, a thin man with eyes like nails hammered too deep into wood, watched without a word as Arthur and another shadowed figure carried the packages inside, one by one, through the back door of the restaurant. They stacked them in the cooler, sealing the door behind them, locking it with a click that echoed like the turning of a vault. When Arthur returned to the alley, the van was already gone. No tire marks, no sound. Only silence. Inside the restaurant, the cooler hummed. Arthur stood before it, his hand pressed against the cold steel, feeling the faint vibration beneath his palm. The packages were still, but he swore he could hear something inside them, a memory, a murmur, the faint echo of voices swallowed by plastic. He closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. The following day, the staff returned, and preparation began in earnest. Vegetables were diced, sauces reduced, tables polished until they shone. But the tension was palpable. Knives clattered too loudly. Spoons slipped from fingers, and the air in the kitchen seemed heavier than usual, thick with an unspoken awareness. Arthur moved among them with calm precision, directing, correcting, always watching. He carried himself like a conductor leading an orchestra, but beneath the surface, a darker anticipation pulsed. Each time he unlocked the cooler and stepped inside, a hush fell over the kitchen. He would emerge minutes later with cuts wrapped tightly, the parcel stacked on trays, his eyes unreadable. By the evening of the banquet, the dining room had been transformed. Candles waited in their holders, glasses lined in rows, the long table set with white linen that seemed too pure for what would rest upon it. The stranger had not yet arrived, but his presence was already felt, the promise of his payment hovering like a shadow, as the first guests filed in, men in dark suits, women in silk dresses, their laughter clipped, and lo, Arthur studied them with a butcher's eye. He saw not their wealth or their finery, but the way their throats moved when they swallowed, the way their eyes sharpened when the first plates were carried out. Hunger was universal. Hunger did not care for morality. The kitchen swelled with heat, pans hissing, knives flashing. Arthur's hands moved with mechanical grace, searing, slicing, plating. The smell filled the air rich, heavy, unmistakable. The staff tried not to meet one another's eyes. They had worked with beef, pork, lamb, but this was different. They did not name it, but they knew. And yet they served. Plate after plate left the kitchen, carried into the dining room where candles flickered and laughter swelled. Guests leaned back in their chairs, their lips stained with wine and grease, their eyes half closed in pleasure. One man let out a sigh that bordered on reverence. A woman laughed too loudly. covering her mouth as though ashamed of how quickly she had devoured her portion. The stranger sat at the head of the table, his expression calm but his eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. Arthur stood in the doorway, watching. His chest rose and fell slowly, the rhythm steady, controlled. To anyone else, he might have looked proud, a chef overseeing the success of his craft. But inside, the hunger gnawed. He could feel it rising in the room, not his alone but collective, the guests' delight merging with something darker, something that pulsed beneath their laughter. For a moment, he thought he saw movement at the edges of the dining room, shadows lengthening where they should not, shapes flickering in the reflection of the glasses. He blinked, and they were gone. But the laughter seemed sharper now, almost brittle, as though the room itself strained to contain it. Arthur turned back to the kitchen, his hands steady on the knives. The banquet had only begun, but already he could sense it. The meat was not just being eaten, it was being welcomed, absorbed, carried forward. And when the night ended, when the plates were cleared and the candles burned low, the guests would leave with more than full stomachs. They would leave carrying the secret in their blood. By the time the final course was served, the dining room had changed. The candlelight had burned lower, the air thick with smoke, and the heavy perfume of roasted flesh. The guests had loosened ties, unbuttoned collars, dabbed grease from their lips with napkins that were no longer white. Wine glasses were drained and refilled, laughter swelling and breaking, punctuated by sighs of satisfaction. But beneath it all was something quieter, a low hum that Arthur alone seemed to hear. It wasn't the clatter of forks, nor the rustle of linen, but something deeper like the pulse of the room itself, slow and insistent, echoing in time with the guests' hearts. Their faces gleamed, flushed and bright, yet their eyes were different now, sharper, hungrier still, though their plates lay empty. Arthur stood in the shadows near the kitchen door, his hands folded, his expression unreadable. He watched the stranger at the head of the table, the man who had ordered the feast. He sat back in his chair, lips curved faintly, eyes fixed on Arthur with a look that was not gratitude but recognition. A silent agreement had been fulfilled. The guests rose at last, some swaying slightly with drink, others clutching their coats against the cool night beyond the restaurant's doors. Their laughter lingered, carried out into the alley, fading into the city streets. One by one, they vanished into the dark until only the stranger remained. He did not hurry. He stood slowly, adjusted his coat, and walked toward Arthur. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant for no ears but his. "They will remember this night," he said, "not just with their tongues but with their blood. You've given them something they will never be free from." Arthur's eyes flickered, but his face stayed still. That is the nature of hunger. It doesn't fade. It only waits. The stranger's smile deepened, though it held no warmth. He slipped an envelope onto the counter between them, its weight thick, the edges stained faintly as though touched by something damp. Then he turned and left, the door closing behind him with a soft finality. Arthur stood alone in the silence that followed. The dining room was empty now, but the air still held their voices, their laughter, their hunger. He walked slowly through the tables, fingertips brushing the backs of chairs still warm from where they had Saturday. The candles sputtered in their holders, the last wax dripping like blood across the linen. In the kitchen, he opened the cooler. The shelves were bare now, the plastic wrappings gone, the hum of the compressor loud in the emptiness. He touched the steel walls, cold and slick beneath his palm, and for a moment thought he heard something, a murmur, faint and wet, like breath against glass. He closed the door, locking it tight. Upstairs, in his narrow apartment, he washed his hands, though there was nothing left on them. He stood at the sink, staring at the reflection in the dark window. For a moment, the face staring back was not his. Its mouth curved wider, its teeth sharper, its eyes hollow but gleaming with hunger. Then it was gone, leaving only his own tired features. Arthur turned away, but the silence pressed close. He knew what came next. The stranger would return. Another order would be placed. The city would always be hungry, and he was the one who fed it. Lying awake in bed, Arthur listened to the sounds of the night, the hum of the refrigerator below, the faint creak of pipes, the distant wail of a siren cutting across the city. But beneath it all, softer than breath, he thought he heard chewing. Not from the street, not from the restaurant, but from everywhere at once, as though the walls themselves had teeth. He closed his eyes, but there was no rest in it, only hunger, waiting. And in that waiting, Arthur smiled, because he knew it would never end. The possessed aunt, Clara, had never asked to raise a child, least of all the son of her sister. The boy was 6 years old, thin as a reed, with wide eyes that carried too much silence for someone so young. His name was Samuel, though he rarely spoke it. The neighbors whispered that his father had been no good, that his mother had worked herself sick to keep them alive, and that when the fever finally took her, there was no one left but Clara. She had not volunteered. She had simply been named. Responsibility by default. The house was small, 2 rooms and a kitchen, the walls thin enough that every sound lingered. Samuel moved carefully through it, as though afraid his footsteps might shatter something. Clara told herself she tried, that she did what she could, but patience was a fragile thing, and the weight of poverty pressed hard. When Samuel made mistakes, as all children do, they seemed larger, heavier, impossible to forgive. That night had been like any other. The lamplight flickered low, the air smelling of boiled potatoes and damp wood. Clara sat at the table, sorting through bills she could not pay, her head aching, her temper thin. Samuel lingered nearby, restless, his small hands fidgeting with a chipped porcelain cup. She had told him not to touch it, not to wander near the table. The sound of it breaking was small, a simple shatter against the floor, but to Clara it rang like a hammer blow. She was on her feet before she realized it, words spilling sharp and cruel, her hand striking down across his arm. The boy yelped, stumbling backward, tears springing fast to his eyes. The sight of his small body curled against the wall, shoulders shaking, should have softened her, but in that moment, anger blinded her. "You careless little fool," she hissed, the heat rising in her chest, her hand lifting again as if to strike. And then the room shifted. It was not the lamp, nor the walls, nor even the boy. It was Clara herself. A sudden crushing pressure swept through her chest, stealing her breath, twisting her balance. The world tilted, the floor rushing up to meet her. She gasped once, her fingers clawing at the air, and then she collapsed. Samuel froze, tears streaking his cheeks, staring at his aunt sprawled on the floor. He whispered her name once, twice, but she did not answer. For a long, terrifying moment, he thought she was gone too. Another body, another grave, another person the world had taken from him. He crawled closer, hands trembling, reaching for her shoulder. Her eyes opened, but when she spoke, it was not her voice. "Samuel," she whispered, the sound softer, warmer, trembling with an ache the boy knew in his bones. "My sweet boy." He blinked, confusion breaking through his fear. The voice was hers and not hers, Clara's mouth, Clara's lips, but the tone was unmistakable. He had heard it in lullabies, in stories told beneath a fever-ridden breath, in the last words spoken before death took her. It was his mother's voice. Samuel's sobs broke anew, not with fear this time, but with longing. He pressed himself against her, clinging as though afraid she would vanish. "Mama?" he whispered. "Clara, no." The thing inside her lifted trembling hands, cupping his face, her eyes shining with tears that were not her own. "I will not let anyone hurt you again," the voice said. "Not even her." Samuel buried his face in her shoulder, the scent of her skin strange but close enough to remember. For the first time since the fever stole his mother, he felt safe. And Clara, somewhere deep inside the fog of her mind, felt her own lips moving, her own throat shaping words she did not command. She struggled, clawed, screamed silently, but the presence was stronger, heavier, filled with a love that drowned out her anger. Her body was no longer hers. It belonged, for that moment, to the dead. When the lamp sputtered and the room fell into deeper shadow, Clara's mouth whispered again, "Steady now," a promise carved in ice. "He is mine, and I will not leave him." Clara did not remember rising to her knees, but she felt them pressed into the wooden floor, cold seeping into bone. Her body bent forward, her arms wrapping the child, though her mind screamed for release. She was both present and absent, a spectator in her own skin. Samuel clung to her as though drowning, his small hands fisting her blouse, his tears damp against her collar. The voice came again, steady now, threaded with a power Clara could not deny. "You will not raise your hand against him again." Clara's lips moved with the words, though her mind recoiled. She tried to protest, to say I didn't mean it. He pushed me too far. I'm not cruel. But the voice drowned her. You will not strike him. You will not curse him. You will not let him believe for one moment that he is unloved. Samuel's eyes widened at the sound, his tears slowing as he stared up at her face. It was Clara's face, but softened in a way he had not seen before. His mouth trembled, whispering, "Mama, please don't go." The voice broke, just slightly, with something that might have been grief. "I will not go, not while he still needs me, not while there is danger in this house." Clara fought harder, clawing at the edges of her mind, but her own strength was no match. A coldness rooted deep in her chest, spreading outward with every word. A possession not of rage, but of fierce, unyielding love. It was more terrifying than any cruelty, because it was absolute. "You, Clara," the voice said sharper now, addressing her directly. "You carry my son's blood under your roof. You carry my duty now, and I will not leave until you swear it." Samuel looked between them, confusion flickering across his small face. "Swear what?" "That she will love you," the voice whispered. "That she will never let harm come to you again. Not from her hand, not from any hand. She will promise, or she will never breathe in peace again." Clara tried to shake her head, but her body obeyed the presence. Her mouth opened, her throat burned. "Promise," the voice hissed inside her skull. "Promise him, promise me." Her eyes filled with tears, tears that stung with fury and helplessness. Her hands cupped Samuel's face again, pressing his cheeks gently, too gently for a woman who had struck him only minutes before. "I promise," she heard herself say, the words raw, unsteady. "I promise I will not hurt you again. I promise I will keep you safe." The boy's eyes shimmered with hope so bright it pierced through the room's gloom. He threw his arms around her neck, sobbing into her shoulder, whispering, thank you," over and over. Inside, Clara howled. The promise was not hers, yet it bound her all the same. She felt it tightening around her like a noose, an oath carved in the marrow of her bones. The spirit had stitched it into her breath. The lamp flickered once, twice, and the shadows in the corners deepened. The cold inside Clara's body ebbed slightly, but not fully. The presence lingered, patient, unyielding. It spoke one final time, a whisper that curled like frost inside her ear. "If you forget, if you falter, I will return, and I will take more than your voice." Then silence. Clara collapsed forward, gasping as though she had surfaced from deep water. Her body was hers again, heavy and trembling. Samuel still clung to her, his breath warm against her skin, his small body trusting, unguarded. For the first time in her life, Clara held him without resistance, and though her mind reeled, though anger and denial tried to rise, something colder pressed them down. The oath thrummed in her chest like a second heartbeat. She could not break it, not ever. When Clara woke the next morning, her body ached as if she had worked all night hauling stones. Her head throbbed with a dull, heavy pain, and her mouth was dry, the taste of iron lingering on her tongue. She pushed herself up from the narrow bed. The sheets twisted around her legs, and for a moment she thought she had dreamed it all. The collapse, the strange voice, the promise forced from her lips. The room looked ordinary. Light pressed weakly through the curtains. The kettle hissed faintly in the kitchen below. Somewhere in the house, Samuel moved, his small footsteps padding softly across the boards. Everything was as it had been, and yet Clara felt wrong inside her skin. She came down the stairs slowly, one hand braced on the wall. Samuel was at the table, folding scraps of paper into clumsy shapes. He looked up when she entered, and in his eyes there was no fear, only a strange, tentative trust. He smiled, small and uncertain, as if afraid it might vanish if she did not return it. Clara stopped short. She had expected him to flinch, to shrink back as he always did after her anger. Instead, he sat still, waiting. She felt a sharp stab of guilt, though she could not say why. The memory of raising her hand, of his cry, was clear, but everything after blurred like smoke. She told herself she must have fainted, exhausted by stress, overcome by shame. There was nothing else it could have been. Still, the weight of the boy's gaze unsettled her. She busied herself with the kettle, pouring tea into a chipped cup, setting bread on the table. Samuel whispered, "Thank you, Aunt Clara," and her chest tightened. She turned away quickly, unable to meet his eyes. Days passed, and life pressed on. Clara worked, cooked, scrubbed, tended to the house. Samuel shadowed her as children do, playing in corners, humming tuneless songs. There were moments brief, fleeting when irritation rose in her like it always had. He spilled water across the floor, tracked mud through the door, tore a seam in his shirt climbing the fence outside. Each time her temper surged hot and sharp, her hand lifting in the old familiar way, and each time, the cold came. It began in her fingertips, creeping up her arm like frost spreading across glass. By the time her hand reached its height, the chill was unbearable, freezing bone, numbing flesh, locking her muscles stiff. She gasped aloud more than once, the shock of it halting her mid-motion. Her eyes would blur, her breath fogging before her, though the room was warm. Samuel would look up at her in those moments, wide-eyed, waiting, and she would lower her hand, her anger scattered, her skin prickled with ice. At night she lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, wondering if she was ill. Perhaps her body had grown weak. Perhaps her mind had conjured the sensation to punish her. Yet, deep inside, she knew better. The cold was not hers. It came from outside, pressing in, filling her when her temper flared. She would remember the faint echo of a voice. If you forget, if you falter, I will return. Clara tried to dismiss it, but the memory of that promise lingered, carved deeper each day. She could not recall speaking the words, yet the certainty of them pressed on her chest. One evening, Samuel dropped a plate. It shattered across the floor, sharp fragments scattering under the table. The sound jolted Clara's nerves, anger sparking before she could stop it. She rounded on him, her hand already rising, her voice sharp. You foolish. The cold slammed into her chest so hard she staggered. Her breath caught, a fog spilling past her lips though the lamp burned hot beside her. Her arm froze midair, trembling violently, her skin white as bone. Samuel froze too, his hands shielding his face, but his eyes peeked through, wide with fear and hope tangled together. Clara could not move. She felt as though someone else's hand had clamped down over hers, forcing it still. In the silence that followed, a whisper brushed her ear, not loud, not even distinct, but enough to raise the hair along her neck. Not again. The anger dissolved, her knees weakened, and she collapsed into the chair, clutching her frozen hand to her chest. Samuel crept forward, gathering the shards carefully in his small fingers, whispering apologies. She watched him in silence, shaken not by his mistake but by the certainty that she was no longer mistress of her own house. Something else lived here, something that would not let her cross that line again. In the nights that followed, Clara dreamt of her sister. Sometimes she appeared in the doorway, pale and still, her eyes glowing with a light Clara could not bear. Sometimes she crouched at Samuel's bedside, stroking his hair, singing in a voice thick with echoes. And sometimes she stood behind Clara herself, one hand resting cold against her shoulder, guiding her movements like a marionette. Clara would wake gasping, her skin clammy, her body trembling with chill. She would rise, drink water, stare at her reflection in the darkened window, and every time she half expected to see not her own face staring back, but her sister's. The days continued, ordinary to anyone looking in, but Clara knew the truth. She was no longer alone in her own body. The dead had made their claim, and every time her temper rose, every time her hand lifted, she felt the warning settle deeper. You promised, and the cold would come again. Clara had always prided herself on being practical. Life had demanded it. There was no room for superstition in a house where every coin was counted, where every meal was stretched thin. And yet, in the weeks that followed, practicality abandoned her. The world she thought she knew had thinned, and through the cracks something colder pressed its way in. It began with small things. She would wake to find the lamp already lit, though she had sworn she blew it out before bed. She would walk into the kitchen to see bread sliced neatly on the counter, though she had not touched a knife. Samuel would greet her in the mornings with a softness in his voice, as though he expected kindness and not scorn. The change unsettled her more than his fear ever had. Clara's memories grew fractured. There were hours she could not account for, moments she was certain she had spoken, only to find Samuel claiming she had said something else entirely. You told me to wash my hands before supper, he said one evening, smiling, and you kissed my head. Clara had no recollection of it. She stared at him, unease creeping through her chest, and muttered only, "Don't talk nonsense." But inside, her heart rattled against her ribs. She began to dread mirrors. Her reflection no longer seemed still. At night, when the lamp burned low, she swore her face moved a fraction slower than her body, as though it lagged behind. Once, leaning over the basin, she saw not her own sharp eyes, but softer ones' eyes she had known once in another face, eyes that had closed forever in a coffin she had wept over. She stumbled back, knocking the basin to the floor, water spreading across the boards like a stain. Her dreams grew worse. She saw her sister standing in the corner of the bedroom, half shrouded in shadow, her hands pale and translucent. She did not speak. She only watched, her gaze fixed on Samuel's sleeping body. The dreams left Clara trembling, uncertain if she had dreamed at all. Sometimes she would wake with the covers tucked more tightly around the boy, though she knew she had not touched him. During the day, the cold lingered. It no longer came only when anger rose. It came at random, sliding icy fingers across her spine as she stirred a pot, as she hung clothes to dry, as she passed Samuel in the hallway. The house itself felt different, as if every beam and nail hummed faintly with an unseen presence. The silence between her and the boy was no longer hostile. It was heavy, waiting, filled with the awareness of someone else listening. The neighbors began to notice her strangeness. At the market, she was told she looked pale, thinner than before. One woman whispered that grief had caught up to her at last, that the burden of raising a child not her own was too much. Clara forced a brittle smile, but her hands shook as she counted coins. She feared the truth would leak from her skin, that they would see the shadow she carried inside. Samuel, meanwhile, seemed lighter. He played more freely in the yard, humming tuneless melodies that Clara recognized with a jolt as songs her sister used to sing. Sometimes he would laugh suddenly, turning to no one visible, his eyes alight as though listening to a voice she could not hear. Once, when she demanded to know what amused him, he said simply, "Mama's here. She says you don't have to be afraid." The words cut deeper than any accusation. Clara fled to her room, shutting the door, pressing her palms hard against her temples. She wanted to deny it, to scream that ghosts did not exist, that voices of the dead did not crawl into the mouths of the living. But when she closed her eyes, she felt her lips tremble, and in the tremor came an echo she did not choose. "You promised." She slammed her fist against the wall, desperate to silence it, but the sound rang hollow. The promise was carved deeper than bone. One evening, after Samuel spilled milk across the table, Clara felt her old anger flare. Her hand twitched upward, a reflex older than her grief. But before it could rise fully, the cold rushed through her veins like a flood. Her jaw locked, her vision blurred, and in the reflection of the window she saw her sister's face overlaying her own, lips curved in warning. She froze, trembling, lowering her hand. Samuel looked at her with wide eyes, then smiled, small and relieved. And for the first time, Clara wondered, was she herself anymore? Or had her sister taken root so deeply that she was only a shell now, a vessel walking on borrowed will? At night she whispered to the dark, not sure if she spoke to God, to her sister, or to the emptiness. "What do you want from me?" she asked. "How long will you stay?" No answer came, only the cold, curling around her like a second skin. Clara pressed her hands to her chest, shuddering. She no longer feared her temper. She feared her absence because each day, each hour, she felt less like Clara and more like the echo of someone who had already died. Winter pressed against the house, its breath seeping through the thin boards, rattling the window panes at night. Clara wrapped Samuel in blankets, kept the fire going as best she could, and listened to the wind scour the chimney like a voice calling from above. The cold outside should have frightened her, but it was nothing compared to the cold within the chill that visited when her temper rose, when her hands trembled with old instincts, when the presence of her sister swept through her veins like frost. Weeks had passed since the first collapse, and Clara no longer asked herself whether it had been real. She knew. Every mirror in the house, every shadow on the wall, reminded her. The woman she had buried still lived here, not in body but in will, carried inside Clara's bones like a guest who refused to leave. At first she had resisted. She had prayed, begged, shouted in the silence of her room, pleading for freedom. But freedom had not come. Instead, she had begun to notice small things, the way Samuel smiled more easily now, the way his shoulders carried less fear, the way his laughter slipped through the halls like sunlight. The boy was changing. And though Clara's pride resisted the thought, she knew why. His mother had not abandoned him. One night, as Samuel slept soundly under the quilt, Clara sat by the fire staring into the flames. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that made her skin prickle. She whispered aloud, though no one sat across from her, "You've made your point. He's safer with you here. But what about me? What am I now? Am I his aunt, his guardian, or just the vessel you walk through?" Her voice trembled, but there was no answer. Only the pop of wood splitting in the hearth. She leaned forward, pressing her hands against her knees, her throat tightening. "Do you even hear me?" she asked. "Or am I already gone?" The air shifted. A draft wound through the room, though the windows were shut tight. It brushed against her cheek, soft as a hand, and in the flicker of the firelight she thought she saw another shadow beside hers on the wall, slender, feminine, familiar. She turned, but there was nothing there. Only Samuel sleeping soundly, his breath even. Clara pressed her lips together, tears stinging her eyes. She realized then that an answer was not necessary. The presence had never promised her peace. It had promised protection, and that promise was not hers to break. The days continued. Clara worked, cooked, scrubbed. Samuel grew sturdier, his cheeks rounder, his eyes brighter. Sometimes he looked at her with a strange expression, as though he saw both women at once, the aunt who raised him and the mother who lingered. Once, after she had bandaged a scrape on his knee, he whispered, "Thank you, Mama." Clara's breath caught, the protest rising in her throat, but then she stopped. She smoothed his hair with trembling fingers, and for the first time she did not correct him. That night, she lay awake long after Samuel drifted to sleep, the moonlight painting pale bars across the floor. She thought of her sister, of her laughter, of her stubbornness, of the fever that had stolen her breath, and she thought of the promise that bound them still. "I can live with this," Clara whispered to the dark, "if it means he lives better." "Say." The cold stirred faintly in her chest, not as punishment this time, but as acknowledgement, as though the presence inside her had nodded in agreement. She closed her eyes, feeling it settle deep, patient and enduring. From that night on, Clara no longer fought it. When the chill came, she let it pass through her. When her lips moved with words she did not choose, she did not resist. She learned to live with the echo of another voice, the weight of another will. It was not possession anymore. It was coexistence. The neighbors still whispered. They said Clara seemed different now, softer with the boy, but thinner, paler, as if some of her life had been drained away. She ignored them. Samuel was thriving, and that was enough. Still, there were nights when she caught her reflection in the window and saw not one face but two, layered faintly together, watching her with the same unwavering eyes. And though fear twisted inside her, she whispered to herself, "He is safe." That is what matters. The wind howled against the house, rattling the shutters, but the fire burned steady. Samuel slept soundly upstairs, and Clara sat in the quiet, knowing she was no longer alone in her own skin and that she never would be again. And now, the night is heavy with what we've heard. 7 stories carried like lanterns through empty streets, their light too fragile to hold back what lurks just beyond. Perhaps you'll close your eyes soon. Try to sleep. Perhaps you'll dream. And if you do, don't be surprised if the faces you met tonight follow you there, whispering in voices you thought were gone, because stories have a way of finding homes inside us, long after the telling ends. Thank you for keeping me company in these late hours. Until next time, remember, the night never truly ends. It only waits.